Hello, and welcome to Skyrim lore to sleep to. Today's reading, Beggar, by Revan. Eslaf Errol was the last of the litter of 5 born to the queen of prosperous Nordic kingdom of Erelgard, Laprocopa, and her husband, the king of Erelgard, Etolaf. During pregnancy, the queen had been more than twice as wide as she was tall, and the act of delivery took 3 months and 6 days after it had begun. It is perhaps understandable that Laprocopa elected, upon expelling Eslaf, to frown, say good riddance, and die. Like many Nords, Etolaf did not care very much for his wife and less for his children. His subjects were puzzled. Therefore, when he announced that he would follow the ancient tradition of his people, of Atmora, of following his beloved spouse to the grave, they had not thought they were particularly in love, nor were they aware that such a tradition existed. Still, the simple people were very grateful, for the little royal drama alleviated their boredom, which was and is a common problem in the more obscure parts of northern Skyrim, particularly in wintertide. He gathered his household staff, and his 5 fat, bawling little heirs in front of him, and divided his estate. To his son No, he gave his title. To his son Lernu, he gave his land. To his son Silvad, he gave his fortune. To his daughter Lakefrita, he gave his army. Tulaf's advisors had suggested he keep the inheritance together for a good of the kingdom, but Tulaf did not particularly care for his advisors, or the kingdom for that matter. Upon making his announcement, he drew his dagger across his throat. One of the nurses, who was rather shy, finally decided to speak as the king's life ebbed away. "Your Highness, you forgot your 5th child, little Eslaf." Good Itolaf groaned. It is somewhat hard to concentrate with blood gushing from one's throat after all. The king tried in vain to think of something to bequeath, but there was nothing left. Finally he sputtered, irritably, "Eslaf should have taken something then," and died. That a babe but a few days old was expected to demand his rightful inheritance was arguably unfair. But so Eslaf Errol was given his birthright with his father's dying breath. He would have nothing but what he had taken. Since no one else would have him, the shy nurse, whose name was Drozba, took the baby home. It was a decrepit little shack, and over the years that followed it became more and more decrepit. Unable to find work, Drozba sold all of her furnishings to buy food for little Eslaf. By the time he was old enough to walk and talk, she had sold the walls and the roof as well, so they had nothing but a floor to call home. And if you've ever been to Skyrim, you can appreciate that that is scarcely sufficient. Drozba did not tell Eslaf the story of his birth, or that his brothers and sisters were leading quite nice lives with their inheritances, for, as we have said, she was rather shy and found it difficult to broach the subject. She was so painfully shy, in fact, that whenever he asked any questions about where he came from, Drozba would run away. That was more or less her answer to everything: to flee. In order to communicate with her at all, Eslaf learned how to run almost as soon as he could walk. He couldn't keep up with his adopted mother at first, but in time he learned to go toe-heel if he anticipated a short but fast sprint, and heel-toe if it seemed Drozba was headed for a long-distance marathon flight. He never did get all the answers he needed from her, but Eslaf did learn how to run. The kingdom of Erelgard had in the years that Eslaf was growing become quite a grim place. King Nope did not have a treasury, for Siobhan had been given that. He did not have any property for income, for Larnu had been given that. He did not have an army to protect the people, for Lysifitra had been given that. Furthermore, as he was but a child, all decisions of the kingdom went through Nope's rather corrupt council. It had become a bureaucratic, exploitative land, and high taxes, rampant crime, and regular incursions from neighboring kingdoms. Not a particular unusual situation for a kingdom of Tamriel, but an unpleasant one nonetheless. The time finally came when the tax collector arrived at Drozba's hovel, such as it was, to collect the only thing he could, the floor. Rather than protest, the poor shy maid ran away, and Eslaf never saw her again. Without a home or a mother, Eslaf did not know what to do. He had grown accustomed to the cold, open air in Drozba's shack, but he was hungry. "May I have a piece of meat?" he asked the butcher down the street. "I'm very hungry." The man had known the boy for years, often spoke to his wife about how sorry he felt for him, growing up in a home with no ceilings or walls. He smiled at Eslaf and said, "Go away or I'll hit you." Eslaf hurriedly left the butcher and went to the nearby tavern. The tavern keeper had been a former valet in the king's court and knew the boy was by right a prince. Many times he had seen the poor ragged lad in the streets and sighed at the way fate had treated him. "May I have something to eat?" Eslaf asked this tavern keeper. "I'm very hungry." "You're lucky I don't cook you up and eat you," replied the tavern keeper. Eslaf hurriedly left the tavern. For the rest of the day, the boy approached the good citizens of Erelgard, begging for food. One person had thrown something at him, but it turned out to be an inedible rock. As night fell, a raggedy man came up to Eslaf, and without saying a word handed him a piece of fruit and a piece of dried meat. The lad took it, wide-eyed, and as he devoured it, thanked the man very sweetly. "If I see you begging on the streets tomorrow," the man growled, "I'll kill you myself. There's only so many beggars we of the guild allow in any one town, and you make it one too many. You're running business." It was a good thing Eslaf Errol knew how to run. He ran all night. Eslaf Errol's story is continued in the book Thief by Revan. If the reader has not yet had the pleasure of reading the first volume in these series on the life of Eslaf Errol, Beggar he should choose this book immediately, for I shan't recap. I will tell you this much, gentle reader. When we last saw Eslaf, he was a boy, an orphan, a failed beggar, running through the wild winter woods of Skyrim, away from his home of Erelgard. He continued running, stopping here and there for many more years, until he was a young man. Eslaf discovered that among the ways of getting food, asking for it was the most troublesome. Far easier was finding it in the wilderness, or taking it from unguarded market stalls. The only thing worse than begging to get food was begging for the opportunity to work for the money to buy it. That seemed needlessly complicated. No, as far as Eslaf was concerned, he was best off being a scavenger, a beggar, and a thief. He committed his first act of thievery shortly after leaving Erelgard, while in the southern woods of Tamborkar, in the rugged land near Mount Jensen, just east the village of Horbeld. Eslaf was starving, having not eaten anything but rather a scrawny raw squirrel in 4 days, and he smelled meat cooking and then found the smoke. A band of minstrel bards was making camp. He watched them from the bushes as they cooked and joked and flirted and sang. He could have asked them for some food, but so many others had refused him before. Instead, he rushed out, grabbed a piece of meat from the fire, and wincing from the burns, scrambled up the nearest tree to devour it while the bard stood under him and laughed. "What is your next move, thief?" giggled a fair, red-headed woman who was covered with tattoos. "How do you intend to disappear without us catching you and punishing you?" As the hunger subsided, Eslov realized she was right. The only way to get out of the tree without falling in their midst was to take the branch down where it hung over a creek. It was a drop over a cliff of about 50 feet. That seemed like the wisest strategy, so Eslov began crawling in that direction. "You do know how to fall, boy," called out a young Khajiit, but a few years older than Eslov, thin but muscular, graceful in his slightest movements. "If you don't, you should just climb down here and take what's coming to you. It's idiotic to break your neck when we'd just give you some bruises and send you on your way." "Of course I know how to fall," Eslov called back, but he didn't. He just thought the trick of falling was to have nothing underneath you and let nature take its course. But 50 feet up, when you're looking down, is enough to give anyone pause. "I'm sorry to doubt your abilities, Master Thief," said the Khajiit, grinning. "Obviously you know how to fall, feet first with your body straight but loose to avoid cracking like an egg. It seems that you're destined to escape us." Eslov wisely followed the Khajiit's hints and leapt into the river, falling without much grace but without hurting himself. In the years that followed, he had to make several more drops from even greater heights, usually after a theft, sometimes without water beneath him, and he improved the basic technique. When he arrived in the western town of Jotunheim, on the morning of his 21st birthday, he didn't take him long to find out who was the richest person most deserving of being burgled. An impregnable palace in a park near the center of town was owned by a mysterious young man named Siobad. Eslov wasted no time in finding the palace and watching it. A fortified palace he had come to learn was like a person, with quirks and habits beneath its hard shell. It was not an old place. Evidently, whatever money this Siobad had come into was fairly recent. It was regularly patrolled by guards, implying that the rich man was fearful of being burgled with good reason. The most distinctive feature of the palace was its tower, rising 100 feet above the stone walls, doubtless giving the occupant a good defensive view. Eslov guessed that if Siobad was as paranoid as he guessed him to be, the tower would also provide a view of the palace storehouse. The rich man would want to keep an eye on his fortune. That meant that the loot couldn't be directly beneath his tower, but somewhere in the courtyard within the city walls. The light in the tower shone all night long, so Eslov boldly decided that the best time to burgle was by the light of day, when Siobad must sleep. That would be the time the guards would least expect the thief to pounce. And so, when the noon sun was shining over the palace, Eslov quickly scaled the wall near the front gate and waited, hidden in the crenellations. The interior courtyard was plain and desolate, with few places to hide, but he saw that there were two wells. One the guards used from time to time to draw up water and slake their thirst, but Eslov noticed that the guards would pass by the other well, never using it. He waited until the guards were distracted, just for a second, by the arrival of a merchant in a wagon bearing goods for the palace. While they were searching his wagon, Eslov leapt, elegantly, feet first, from the wall into the well. It was not a particularly soft landing, for, as Eslov had guessed, the well was not full of water, but gold. Still, he knew how to roll after a fall, and he didn't hurt himself. In the dank subterranean storehouse he stuffed his pockets with gold, and was about to go to the door, which he assumed would lead to the tower, when he noticed a gem the size of an apple, worth more than all of the gold that was left. Eslov found room for it down his pants. The door did indeed lead to the tower, and Eslov followed its curving stairwell up, walking quietly but quickly. At the top, he found the master of the palace's private quarters, ornate and cold, with invaluable artwork and decorative swords and shields on the walls. Eslov assumed the slowing lump under the sheets was Siobhan, but he didn't investigate too closely. He crept to the windows and looked out. It was going to be a difficult fall for certes. He needed to jump from the tower past the walls and hit the tree on the other side. The tree branches would hurt, but they would break his fall, and there was a pile of hay he had left under the tree to prevent further injury. Eslov was about to leap when the occupant of the room woke up with a start, yelling, "My gem!" Eslov stared at him for a second, wide-eyed. They looked alike. Not surprising, since they were brothers. Eslov Errol's story is continued in the book Warrior by Revan. This is the third book in a 4-book series. If you have not read the first 2 books, Beggar and Thief, you would be well advised to do so. Siobhan Errol did not know much of his past, nor did he care to. As a child, he had lived in Errolgard, but the kingdom was very poor, and taxes were as a result very high. He was too young to manage his abundant inheritance, but his servants, fearing that their master would be ruined, moved him to Jotunheim. No one knew why that location was picked. Some old maid, long dead now, had thought it was a good place to raise a child. No one else had a better idea. There may have been children with a more pampered, more spoiled existence than young Siobhan, but that is doubtful. As he grew, he understood that he was rich, but he had nothing else. No family, no social position, no security at all. Loyalty, he found out on more than one occasion, cannot truly be bought. Knowing that he had but one asset, a vast fortune, he was determined to protect it and, if possible, increase it. Some otherwise perfectly nice people are greedy, but Siobhan was that rare accident of nature or breeding who has no other interest but acquiring and hoarding gold. He was willing to do almost anything to increase his fortune. Most recently, he had begun secretly in hiring mercenaries to attack desirable properties, and then buying them when no one wanted to live there anymore. The attacks would then, of course, cease, and Siobhan would have profitable land which he had purchased for a song. It had begun small with a few farms, but recently he had begun a more ambitious campaign. In north-central Skyrim, there is an area called the Alto, which is of unique geographical interest. It is a dormant volcanic valley, surrounded on all sides by glaciers, so the earth is hot from the volcano, but the constant water drizzle and air is frigid. A grape called the jasbe grows there comfortably, and everywhere else in Tamriel it withers and dies. This strange vineyard is a privately owned, and the wine produced from it thus rare and extremely expensive. It is said that the emperor needs the permission of the imperial council to have a glass of it once a year. In order to harass the owner of the Alto into selling its land cheap, Siobhan had to go hire more than a few mercenaries. He had to hire the finest private army in Skyrim. Siobhan did not like spending money, but he had agreed to pay the general of the army, a woman called Lysifitra, a gem the size of an apple. He had not given it to her yet. Payment was to be delivered on the success of the mission, but he had trouble sleeping knowing that he was going to give up such a prize. He always slept during the day, so he could watch his storehouse by night, when he knew thieves were about. That brings us up to this moment when, after a fitful sleep, Siobhan woke up at about noon and surprised a thief in his bedroom. The thief was Eslaf. Eslaf had been contemplating a leap from the window, 100 feet down into the branches of a tree beyond the walls of the fortified palace, and a tumble into a stack of hay. Anyone who has ever attempted such a feat will testify that it takes some concentration and nerve to do such a thing. When he saw that the rich man sleeping in the room had awakened, both left him, and Eslaf slipped behind a tall, ornamental shield on display to wait for Siobhan to go back to sleep. Siobhan did not go back to sleep. He had heard nothing, but could feel someone in the room with him. He stood up and began pacing the room. Siobhan paced, and gradually decided that he was imagining things. No one was there. His fortune was safe and secure. He was returning to his bed when he heard a clunk. Turning around, he saw the gem, the one he was to give Lassifitra, on the floor by the Atmoran cavalry shield. A hand reached out from behind the shield and grabbed it up. "Thief!" Siobhan cried out, grabbing a jeweled Akaviri katana from the wall and lunging at the shield. The fight between Eslaf and Siobhan did not go down in the annals of great duels. Siobhan did not know how to use a sword, and Eslaf was no expert at blocking with a shield. It was clumsy, it was awkward. Siobhan was furious, but was physiologically incapable of using the sword in any way that could damage its fine filigree, reducing its market value. Eslaf kept moving, dragging the shield with him, trying to keep it between him and the blade, which is, after all, the most essential part of any block. Siobhan screamed in frustration as he struck at the shield, bumping its way across the room. He even tried negotiating with the thief, explaining that the gem was promised to a great warrior named Lassifitra, and if he would give it back, Siobhan would happily give him something else in return. Eslaf was not a genius, but he did not believe that. By the time Siobhan's guards came to the bedroom in response to their master's calls, he had succeeded in backing the shield into a window. They fell on the shield, having considerable more expertise with their swords than Siobhan did, but they discovered that there was no one behind it. Eslaf had leapt out the window and escaped. As he ran heavily through the streets of Jotunheim, making jingling noises from the gold coins in his pocket, and feeling the huge gem chafe where he had hidden it, Eslaf did not know where he should go next. He knew only that he could never go back to that town, and he must avoid this warrior, named Lassifitra, who had claims on the jewel. Eslaf Errol's story is continued in the book King by Revan. Gentle reader, you will not understand a word of what follows, unless you have read and committed to memory the first 3 volumes in this series, Beggar, Thief, and Warrior, which leads up to this, the conclusion. I encourage you to seek them out at your favorite bookseller. We last left Eslaf Errol, fleeing for his life, which was a common enough occurrence for him. He had stolen a lot of gold, and one particularly large gem, from a rich man in Jotunheim, named Siobhan. The thief fled north, spending the gold wildly, as thieves generally do, for all sorts of illicit pleasures, which would no doubt disturb the gentleman or lady reading this, so I will not go into detail. The one thing he held on to was the gem. He didn't keep it because of any particular attachment, because he did not know anyone rich enough to buy it from him. So he found himself in the ironic situation of being penniless and having in his possession a gem worth millions. "Will you give me a room?" some bread, and a flagon of beer in exchange for this? He asked a tavern keep in the little village of Cravensvold, which was so far north it was half situated on the Sea of Ghosts. The tavern keep looked at it suspiciously. "It's just crystal," Eslov said quickly, "but isn't it pretty?" "Let me see that," said a young armor-clad woman at the end of the bar. Without waiting permission, she picked up the gem, studied it, and smiled not very sweetly at Eslov. "Would you join me at my table?" "I'm actually in a bit of a hurry," replied Eslov, holding out his hand for the stone. "Another time?" "Out of respect for my friend, the tavern keep here, my men and I leave our weapons behind when we come in here," the woman said casually, not handing the gem back, but picking up a broom that was sitting against the bar. "I can assure you, however, that I can use this quite effectively as a blunt instrument. Not a weapon, of course, but an instrument to stun, medicinally crush a bone or two, and then, once it is on the inside—" "Which table?" asked Eslov quickly. The young woman led him to a large table in the back of the tavern, where 10 of the biggest Nord brutes Eslov had ever seen were sitting. They looked at him with polite disinterest, as if he were a strange insect, worth briefly studying before crushing. "My name is Lysiphetra," she said, and Eslov blinked. That was the name Children had uttered before Eslov had made his escape. "And these are my lieutenants. I am the commander of a very large, independent army of noble knights, the very best in Skyrim. Most recently we were given a job to attack a vineyard in the Alto, to force its owner, a man named Larnu, to sell to our employer, a man named Siobud. Our payment was to be a gem of surpassing size and quality, quite famous and unmistakable. We did as we were asked, and when we went to Siobud to collect our fee, he told us he was unable to pay due to a recent burglary. In the end, though, he saw things our way and paid us an amount of gold almost equal to the worth of the prized jewel. It did not empty out his treasure entirely, but it meant he was unable to buy the land in the Alto after all. So we were not paid enough. Siobud has taken a heavy financial blow, and Lernu's prized crop of jasbay has been temporarily destroyed for naught." Lysiphetra took a long, slow drink of her mead before continuing. "Now, I wonder, could you tell me, how came you in possession of this gem we were promised?" Eslov did not answer at once. Instead, he took a piece of bread from the plate of the savage bearded barbarian on his left and ate it. "I'm sorry," he said, his mouth full. "May I? Of course, I couldn't stop you from taking the gem even if I wanted to, and as a matter of fact, I don't mind at all. It's also useless to deny how it came into my possession. I stole it from your employer. I certainly didn't mean you or your noble knights any harm by it, but I can understand why the word of a thief is not suitable for one such as yourself." "No," replied Lysiphetra, frowning, but her eyes showing amusement. "Not suitable at all." "But before you kill me," Eslov said, grabbing another piece of bread, "tell me how suitable it is for noble knights such as yourselves to be paid twice for one job. I have no honor myself, but I would have thought that since Siobud took a profit loss to pay you, and now you have the gem, your handsome profit is not entirely honorable." Lysiphetra picked up the broom and looked at Eslov. Then she laughed. "What is your name, thief?" "Eslov," said the thief. "We will take the gem, as was promised to us, but you are right. We should not be paid twice for the same job. So," said the warrior woman, putting down the broomstick, "you are our new employer. What would you have your own army do for you?" Many people could find quite a few good uses for their own army, but Eslov was not among them. He searched his brain, and finally it was decided that it was a debt to be paid later. For all her brutality, Lysiphetra was a simple woman, raised, he learned, by the very army she commanded. Fighting and honor were the only things she knew. When Eslov left Cravensvold, he had an army at his back and call, but not a coin to his name. He knew he would have to steal something soon. As he wandered the woods, scrounging for food, he was beset with a strange feeling of familiarity. These were the very woods he had been in as a child, also starving, also scrounging. When he came out on the road, he found that he had come back to the kingdom where he had been raised by the dear, stupid, shy maid Drozba. He was in Erelgard. It had fallen even deeper into despair since his youth. The shops had refused him food, were boarded up, abandoned. The only people left were hollow, hopeless figures, so ravaged by taxation, despotism, and barbaric raids that they were too weak to flee. Eslov realized how lucky he was to have gotten out in his youth. There was, however, a castle and a king. Eslov immediately made plans to raid the treasury. As usual, he watched the place carefully, taking note of the security and the habits of the guards. This took some time. In the end, he realized there was no security and no guards. He walked in the front door and down the empty corridors to the treasury. It was full of precisely nothing, except one man. He was Eslov's age, but looked much older. "There's nothing to steal," he said. "Would that there was." King Nope, though prematurely aged, had the same white blonde hair and blue eyes like broken glass that Eslov had. In fact, he resembled Shobud and Lysiphetra as well. And though Eslov had never met the ruined landlord of Alto Lernu, he looked him too. Not surprisingly, since they were quintuplets. "So you have nothing?" asked Eslov gently. "Nothing except my poor kingdom, cursed." The king grumbled. "Before I came to the throne it was powerful and rich, but I inherited none of that, only the title. For my entire life I've had responsibility thrust on my shoulders, but never had the means to handle it properly. I look over the desolation which is my birthright, and I hate it. If it were possible to steal a kingdom, I would not lift a finger to stop you." It was, it turned out, quite possible to steal a kingdom. Eslov became known as Nope. A deception easily done, given their physical similarities. The real Nope, taking the name of Lenkalu, happily left his demesne, becoming eventually a simple worker of the vineyards of the Alto. For the first time free of responsibility, he fell into his new life with gusto, the years melting off him. The new Nope called in his favor with Lysiphetra, using her army to restore peace to the kingdom of Erelgard. Now that it was safe, business and commerce began to return to the land, and Eslov reduced the tyrannical taxes to encourage it to grow. Upon hearing that, Shobud, ever nervous about losing his money, elected to return to the land of his birth. When he died years later, out of greed, he had refused to name someone an heir, so the kingdom received its entire fortune. Eslov used part of the gold to buy the vineyards of the Alto after hearing great things of it from Nope. And so it was that Erelgard was returned to the previous prosperity by a fifth-born child of King Utalof, Eslov Erel, beggar, thief, warrior of sorts, and king. Today's book is A Gentleman's Guide to Whiterun by Mikhail the Bard. Welcome, good sir, to this indispensable guide. Within these pages, I, your humble author and guide, will describe to you the great city of Whiterun, the jewel of the North. Whiterun offers numerous diversions for the man in search of adventure, fortune, and companionship, whether for a night or for a lifetime. The city is graced with not one, but two worthy taverns, and there are maids and wenches aplenty. The city is located rather centrally in Skyrim, and this is well, for it is not far from anywhere. Perched high upon a rocky hill, Whiterun dominates the grassy plains that surround it. High wooden walls protect its denizens from the wolves, mammoths, bandits, and other dangers lurking beyond. When you first enter through the city's main gate, you will find yourself in the Plains District. This is so named because it is the lowest of the city's three neighborhoods. But here can be found the Bannered Mare, which I count amongst it the finest taverns in all of Skyrim. The scenery within is quite compelling if you have an eye for the fairer sex. A stout lass named Hulda tends the bar. Don't let that stony Nord exterior fool you, for she is possessed of that same fiery passion that all Nord women try so hard to conceal. Sadia, the barmaid, is an exotic Redguard beauty. She's quite mysterious, and your humble author is determined to learn her secrets. Outside the Bannered Mare is a modest marketplace, and here's where I found true love. Though I would never deter a fellow hunting hound from the chase, for indeed, why should I author these tomes, if not to provide guidance in this very matter? I must ask that you do me this one kindness. Her name is Carlotta Valentia, and she is a magnificent beauty who makes a modest living selling bread and produce in the daylight hours. By the gods, I will make that feisty beauty mine some day. And of course, there are other services to be found in the Plains District. Bellathor's General Goods offers various sundry wares for the adventurous traveler, and Arcadia's Cauldron offers what tonics and herbs one would expect from an apothecary's shop. Arcadia herself is an amiable sort. I often visit her to make conversation, as she is a fellow imperial far from home. She is, however, a bit old for my taste. A gentleman of advanced years might find in her a worthy companion. Should you need your blade sharpened or your armor hammered, War Maidens offers smithing services very near the main gate. The smith is a pretty Nord named Adriana Venici, but she is married to a great hulking brute named Ulfbert Warbeer. Adrian is quite fair, but I should not want to find myself being introduced to the keen edge of that husband's war axe. If married ladies are your preferred sport, then have at. But don't say you weren't warned. Near the smith is the Drunken Huntsman. Here, some of the wealthier gentlemen gather to share both drink and rumors of the wide world. If you prefer a more distinguished class of company while you sip fine wine, you'll be well at home here. Of the Wind District I have little to say. Most of the buildings in the second tier of the city are residences, though there is also a temple of Kinnereth and Jorvaskr, the mead hall of the companions. There are some intriguing prospects to be found in the mead hall, should you favor a strong and fearless warrior woman. You will find little game at the temple, however. The priestess, Danica Purespring, is interested almost exclusively in spiritual matters. At last, we come to the Cloud District, exclusive domain of the Jarl's castle. I have had some merry adventures within the stone walls of Dragon's Reach, let me tell you. The serving girls are most easily impressed by a well-spoken Imperial. After all, the nights in Skyrim do grow quite cold, if you take my meaning. And I will not deny that I have visited the town's jail once or twice, which can be found in the lower levels of the palace. As for the Jarl and his court, take pains to avoid them. I find that they lack any sense of humor or appreciation for the imperial culture. Besides which, they are all wealthy men, and so must be viewed as your most serious competition. These Nords are simple folk after all, and too easily swayed by the sight of fine clothes and a purse full of septims. Now, I will conclude this work by wishing you a great success in your pursuits of women and wine. Spare a moment in your revels and think of me, your humble author, and the risks I have taken to bring you this most thorough report on all things of interest to this discerning gentleman in the grand city of Whiterun. Ah, but I will not lie and say that it was all a hardship. After all, who could want to sleep alone in such a cold, hard land as this? Not I. A minor maze. A minor maze. Shalador and Labyrinthian. Labyrinthian's modern notoriety was gained in the early part of the Third Era. Part of the Staff of Chaos was recovered from the Labyrinthian, which became instrumental in the overthrow of Yegortharn, ending the Imperial Simulacrum. This site has since become embedded in the minds of all subjects of the Empire, and the ruins are occasionally visited by loyalist pilgrims, retracing the steps of the Eternal Champion. The namesake of the Labyrinthian is somewhat less commonly known, however. The foreboding ruins were originally built as a temple to the dragons. This grew into Bromanyar, the great city of that era. Bromanyar is believed by some to have been the capital of Skyrim at the height of the dragon cult's influence there. Little historical record exists to verify or refute this, but it is known that the highest-ranking priests of the cult met at Labyrinthian to discuss matters of ruling. Bromanyar crumbled, however, along with the rest of the dragon cult, and the site lay abandoned for many years, a deteriorating reminder of those benighted days of the Nords. Not until the days of Shalador would the ruins come into use again. Shalador the Archmage was famous for his exploits in the First Era. Various tales tell of him battling Dwemer legions single-handedly, building the city of Winterhold with a whispered spell, stealing the secret of life from Akatosh, or constructing Labyrinthian himself. While many Shalador legends are hyperbole or outright fabrication, we can discover some truth behind his involvement with Labyrinthian. Shalador stood at the forefront of a movement to enact higher standards among mages, and to discourage spell use among the common castes. This effort, dubiously credited with the original organization and formation of the schools of magic and the foundation of the college at Winterhold. Consistent with this mentality, Shalador constructed his labyrinth deep within the ruins of Bromanyar to test new archmages. While navigating the destroyed city itself was not explicitly a part of the test, many candidates did not survive the journey. Shalador valued both academic knowledge as well as practical skills, and simply getting to the labyrinth required the latter. Shalador's Labyrinthian is actually two intersecting mazes in an hourglass pattern. One maze could not be completed without exiting the other first, which makes the only existing instruction for the test especially mysterious. Enter twice, exit only once. Alteration will lead you to destruction. Only illusion shows the way to restoration. Conjure not, but be conjured instead. We can only guess at what the solution to the test may have been, as Labyrinthian became notorious for not only the number of potential archmages who died there, but for the intense secrecy of those who succeeded. Labyrinthian eventually ceased to be used, and is regarded as a symbol of a more brutal age by modern institutions for magical studies. The ruins lay empty again, overrun with wild animals and avoided by travelers. The long history and legacy of this place, however, seems as likely to be erased from our minds as the ruins themselves are likely to sink into the sea. Today's reading: A Dream of Sovngarde. In a few hours, I will likely be dead. My men and I, Nords of Skyrim all, will soon join with the Emperor's legions to attack the Imperial City. The Aldmeri are entrenched within, and our losses will be severe. It is a desperate gambit, for if we do not reclaim the city, we will lose the war. Last night I prayed to mighty Talos for courage and strength in the battle to come. In these last cold hours before the sun rises, I sit down to write this account of a dream I had not long after. I believe this dream was the answer to my prayers, and I would pass along the wisdom it contained to my kinsmen for the battles they will fight in the years after my passing. In the dream, I walked through mists toward the sound of laughter, merriment, and the sounds of the north. The mists soon cleared, and before me lay a great chasm. Waters thundered over its brim, and so deep it was I could not see the bottom. A great bridge, made all of whalebone, was the only means to cross, and so I took it. It was only a few steps onto the bridge that I encountered a warrior, grim and strong. "I am soon master of trials," he said to me, his voice booming and echoing upon the walls of the high mountains all around us. With a wave, he bade me pass on. I knew in my heart that I was granted passage only because I was a visitor. Should the hour come when I return here after my mortal life, the legends say that I must best this dread warrior in single combat. Beyond the bridge, a great stone longhouse rose up before me, so tall as to nearly touch the clouds. Though it took all my strength, I pushed open the towering oaken door and beheld the torch-lit feast hall. Here were assembled the greatest heroes of the Nords, all drinking mead poured from great kegs and singing battle songs, suckling pigs turned on a long iron spit over a roaring fire. My mouth watered at the smell of roast meat, and my heart was glad to hear the songs of old. "Come forth," cried out a hoary man, who sat upon a high wooden chair. This I knew to be Isgrimor, father of Skyrim and the Nords. I approached and knelt before him. "You find yourself in Sovngarde, Hall of the Honored Dead. Now, what would you have of me, son of the North?" he bellowed. "I seek counsel," said I, "for tomorrow we fight a desperate battle, and my heart is full of fear." Isgrimor raised his tankard to his lips and drank until the cup was empty. Then he spoke once more. "Remember this always, son of the North. A Nord is judged not by the manner in which he lived, but the manner in which he died." With that, he cast aside his flagon, raised his fist in the air, and roared a great cheer. The other heroes rose to their feet and cheered in answer. The sounds still rang in my ears when I awoke. I gathered my men and told them of my vision. The words seemed to fill their hearts with courage. "The horns are blowing and the banners are raised. The time has come to muster. May Talos grant us victory this day, and if I am found worthy, may I once again look upon that great feast hall." Skardon Free Winter. A Dubious Tale of Crystal Tower by Bibinus Gion. This story was first told to me when I was a neonate, newly studying the Crystal Tower of Somerset. I was admiring the famous animal pens of the tower when I was approached by an older student. The fellow told me this tale seemed very trustworthy at first, but, as this reader will soon discover, the tale was very dubious indeed. Of course, I have told it since to other neonates of the tower in the same spirit. I offer the following for your august consideration, gentle reader. Many, many years back, a talented but poor bard was passing through Somerset, looking for work. He could sing, he could dance, he could act, but no one had any use for his performances. The poor bard was lugubrious, but he still visited the taverns and palaces day after day, begging for a chance to showcase his talents. One day, dejected from more bad luck, he was approached by a tall elf in a long robe, a magister of the Crystal Tower, in charge of the animal pens. The elf tells the bard of the white ape they made a cell for at the tower, how it had died en route. There was a royal party from Firsthold visiting who had been promised a glimpse at a rare white ape. The magister had a costume for the bard if he would deign to act out the part of the ape for the visitors. The bard had promised himself to take the first part that came his way, no matter how minor, so he agreed. The elf promised that the charade would last no longer than a fortnight when the visitors left. For the first several days of the masquerade, the bard did nothing more than sit in the back of the pen. He was afraid to move and show the possible imperfections of the ape costume. In time, he became bored and began walking around. He suddenly noticed that the royal party was watching, fascinated. Happy that the ruse was working, he decided to enliven the act. Soon, he had both a performance and a crowd. Instead of dancing a traditional elven jig, he would swing around the cell with every acrobatic trick he knew. Instead of singing a ballad, he would roar and imagined a rare white ape might roar. A crowd loved it. The party outside his cell grew larger and larger every day. One day, he was performing for the crowd, his finest work to date. He swung himself round and round, roaring and bleeding. His hand slipped and he went flying through the bar and into the next cell door, where a snow wolf was in residence. Hackling its back and growling, the snow wolf began to inch toward the bard. Seeing no other way out, the bard screamed, "Help! Help!" The snow wolf whispered, "Shut up or you'll get us all fired." Today's reading: A Children's Onad. The Onad, paraphrased. The first ones were brothers, Anu and Padme. They came into the void, and time began. As Anu and Padme wandered into the void, the interplay of light and darkness created Nur. Both Anu and Padme were amazed and delighted with her appearance, but she loved Anu, and Padme retreated from them in bitterness. Nur became pregnant, but before she gave birth, Padme returned, professing his love for Nur. She told him that she loved only Anu, and Padme beat her in rage. Anu returned, fought Padme, and cast him outside time. Nur gave birth to creation, but died from her injuries soon after. Anu, grieving, hid himself in the sun and slept. Meanwhile, life sprang up on the 12 worlds of creation and flourished. After many ages, Padme was able to return to time. He saw creation and hated it. He swung his sword, shattering the 12 worlds in their alignment. Anu awoke and fought Padme again. The long and furious battle ended with Anu and the victor. He cast aside the body of his brother, who he believed was dead, and attempted to save creation by forming the remnants of the 12 worlds into one. Nirn, the world of Tamriel. As he was doing so, Padme struck him through the chest with one last blow. Anu grappled with his brother and pulled them both outside time forever. The blood of Padme became the Daedra. The blood of Anu became the stars. The mingled blood of both became the Aedra, hence their capacity for good and evil, and their greater affinity for earthly affairs than the Daedra, who have no common connection with creation. On the world of Nirn, all was chaos. The only survivors of the 12 worlds of creation were the Elnofi and the Hist. The Elnofi are the ancestors of Mer and men. The Hist are the trees of Argonia. Nirn originally was all land with interspersed seas, but no oceans. A large fragment of Elnofe world landed on Nirn relatively intact, and the Elnofe living there were the ancestors of the Mer. These Elnofe fortified their borders from the chaos outside, hid their pocket of calm, and attempted to live on as before. Other Elnofe arrived on Nirn, scattered amid the confusion jumble and shattered worlds, wandering and finding each other over the years. Eventually, the wandering Elnofe found the hidden land of Old Elnofe, and they were amazed and joyful to find their kin living amid the splendor of ages past. The wandering Elnofe expected to be welcomed into the peaceful realm, but the old Elnofe looked on them as degenerates fallen from their former glory. For whatever reason, war broke out and raged across the whole of Nirn. The old Elnofe retained their ancient power and knowledge, but the wanderers were more numerous and toughened by their long struggle to survive on Nirn. This war reshaped the face of Nirn, sinking much of the land beneath new oceans and leaving the lands as we know them, Tamriel, Akavir, Atmora, and Yokota. The old Elnofe realm, although ruined, became Tamriel. The remnants of the wonders were left divided on the other 3 continents. Over many years, the Elnofe of Tamriel became the Mer, elves, the Dwemer, the Deep Ones, sometimes called dwarves, the Chimer, the Changed Ones, who later became the Dunmer, the Dunmer, the Dark or Cursed Ones, the Dark Elves, the Bosmer, the Green or Forest Ones, the Wood Elves, and the Altmer, the Elder or High Ones, the High Elves. On the other continents, the wandering Elnofe became the men, the Nords of Atmora, the Red Guards of Yokota, and the Seischi of Akavir. The Hist were bystanders in the Elnofe War, but most of their realm was destroyed as the war passed over it. A small corner of it survived to become Black Marsh and Tamriel, but most of their realm was sunk beneath the sea. Eventually, men returned to Tamriel. The Nords were first, colonizing the northern coast of Tamriel before recorded history, led by the legendary Ysgramor. The 13th of his line, King Harold, was the first to appear in written history, and so the mythic era ended. Today's reading: A Scholar's Guide to Nymphs by Vandam Barras. I grew up a scholar, an ascetic devoted to knowledge, with eyes that saw beauty in the fascinating passage in a dusty tome, love in the candle that allowed me to study on starless nights, passion in a well-reasoned argument of a long-dead issue. I was a student who never graduated and was never expelled. Though I am not defending myself, I should further define myself. I am not what you would call a prude. In fact, I can speak of subjects in a detached way that would make the most debauched strumpet of Skyhawk blush with discovered modesty. I wrote an essay, The House of Dibella as a Scholar Should, analyzing the cult of beauty and physical relations as one might study crop rotation or the digestive system of an orc. The acquaintances of mine, who were inclined to wink and giggle, I tolerated, but barely. With all that said, The reader will understand that when I decided to study the language of the nymphs in order to study their character and culture, it was not a decision I made on an account of prurience or lust. Scholars have historically neglected the nymph as a subject worthy of research, and this neglect I attribute to prejudice. The sages with whom I have spoken on the subject have eloquently and intelligently formed sentences which, boiled down, can be translated as, nymphs look like beautiful naked women who skip along tra-la-la and like to have indiscriminate sex. What could they have to say that would be of any interest? So here I was, faced with the most daunting of projects. To study and research a species unstudied is a potentially rewarding challenge. If the subject was unstudied because the scientific community had deemed it beneath interest, a potentially rewarding but decidedly frustrating challenge. If I spent months in serious study of their language and culture, and additionally time in their company and discovered nothing more than that the common prejudice is correct, the term laughingstock would not do me justice. So, excited and nervous for reasons unrelated to the notoriously promiscuous behavior of my subjects, I began my studies. I mastered the language, a melodious tongue that sounds like wild elf and fairy, but share no vocabulary with them. I studied the lore, and found it to be, on the whole, little more than pornography and crude conjecture. I next had to find a nymph. From my centralized location in the imperial city, I found it easy to send word around to several well-known temples and guilds devoted to study in all the provinces. Not all replies back were serious in nature, but one, from the school of Giulianos and Sentinel, helped me considerably. To Magister Oitos and his disciples, I here offer my sincere gratitude. Nymphs are extremely shy creatures, no matter what the more obscene stories will tell you. No one who I've spoken with has had one seek him or her out. Thus, to speak with a nymph requires energy and patience. Out of courtesy for her privacy, I will not here give the location of the little grotto off the coast of Hammerfell where I found the nymph. It took 3 months of patient waiting, leaving presents where I knew the nymph would be, before the nymph stood still at my approach. I remember I was carrying a bouquet of purple and white tetias, and she looked at them and then at me and smiled. The effect of her smile was truly magical, I'm convinced. Her body was, of course, perfect, her face lovely and serene, her hair like silk flame. But until she smiled, she was beautiful in the abstract, a perfect statue by a master. The smile made her approachable and thus terrifying. "For you," I said, attempting my first utterance of nymph to a real nymph. Her smile grew into a grin, which became a giggle and then a laugh. The reader has doubtless heard of the silver laughter of the elves. The nymph's laugh is earthy and spontaneous, and very suggestive. "And what do you want from me in return, mortal?" she asked. I am, there is no, I should say, known word in the nymph language for scholar. I am a man who likes to learn things, and I want to learn things about you. And I did. Nymphs are the wisest, most wonderful creatures in Tamriel. My nymph, her name is Aelia, a poor phonetic translation of a word that sounds more like a light wind blowing through a small crack in a hollow chamber. And she knows more about the behavior and varieties of the deep woodland creatures than the greatest wood elf scholar I've ever met. She taught me of flowers and ghosts, and creatures too fast and timid to have ever been seen by man. Aelia taught me how to learn for the very first time, how to open my own mind to all the possibilities of life, and how to use that knowledge, not just to hold in my cramped brain like a dragon's hoard. If you ever meet a nymph, speak to her. Editor's note: the writer Bondambaris is no longer a scholar at the Imperial University. He deposited this manuscript and disappeared from the civilized world. His current whereabouts are unknown. Today's reading: A Tragedy in Black. A folk tale from the time of the Oblivion Crisis. The Dremora looked on the young boy with disdain. He looked to be no more than 17 or 18, on the cusp of manhood. You have summoned me? Mother says I'm good with spells. Someday, I'm gonna be a wizard, maybe even archmage. And what would your mother know of magic, boy? She's a wizard. She's an enchanter at the Arcane University. Ah, another dabbler in the mystic arts. I'm certain she is barely mediocre. You shut up. I read the scroll. I get to tell you what to do. The Dremora was silent. Compulsion bound his voice. I want to know how to make a magic dress. I need it for her birthday. The Dremora's answer was more silence. You have to tell me. It's in the rules. Freed from the previous compulsion, the Dremora answered, First, you will need a soul gem. I happen to have one, and would gladly give it to you, for so noble a cause. Really? Why do I need it? With a hidden smile, the Dremora handed over the dull black gem. It is not enough to cast a spell upon an inert object. Magic requires thought, intent, will, and emotion. The soul powers the enchantment. The bigger the soul, the more powerful the enchantment. So how big is the one in this soul gem? Oh, that one is empty. You'll have to fill it. But it can hold the largest of souls easily. Do you know how to do that? No, the young man said, sullenly. Let me show you. You cast a spell like this. The tendrils of the soul trap spell spilled from his fingers and surrounded the boy. The young man's eyes went wide. I didn't feel anything, he complained. How about now? The Dremora asked, plunging his talons into the youth's rib cage. His heart beat only once before it was pulled from his chest. Quickly, the Dremora snatched back the black soul gem, just as the youth died. His soul tried to flee, but was trapped by the spell and drawn into the gem. Only black soul gems can hold the souls of men and elves. Your mother obviously never told you to never accept a freely given gift from a summoned Dremora, he said to the corpse. You see, it breaks the conjuration, freeing the summoned from the summoner. Now let's go find your mother. After all, I have another black soul gem. Today's reading: An Explorer's Guide to Skyrim by Marcius Carvain and Viscount Bruma. Far too often, noble visitors from Cyrodiil see little more of Skyrim than the view from their carriage. To be sure, this coarse, uncivilized province is far from hospitable, but it is also a place of fierce, wild beauty, with grand vistas and inspiring natural wonders awaiting those with the will to seek them out, and the refinement to truly appreciate them. If you are of a mind to seek Skyrim for yourself, I recommend beginning your adventure as I did, by seeking out Stones of Fate. No doubt you are taken aback by the name as I once was. The provincials and village folk have all manner of dark tales about these ancient monuments. Stories of necromantic rituals and fell spirits of great and terrible powers conferred on any who dare to touch them. The stories are, as Jarl Igrif once told me, a load of mammoth dung. A bit uncouth, but you get the point. To be sure, keep your guards with you at all times. Brigands and wild animals are never to be taken lightly. But the stones themselves are nothing to fear. Quite the contrary. Their proximity to cities and roads makes them ideal destinations for the novice explorer, and many boast spectacular views that make the journey well worth the effort. To whet your appetite, here are 4 such locations. Most travelers enter Skyrim by way of Helgen, gateway to the north. If you find yourself in this backwater hovel, consider taking an afternoon's ride to the north, keeping to the road as it winds down the cliffs at the eastern lake of Ilmenata. Just off the path, on a small bluff, lie 3 guardian stones, the greatest concentration of standing stones in all Skyrim. The view of the lake here at sunset is simply sublime. Visitors from Shadenall will pass through Riften, city of intrigue and larceny since Tiber Septim's day. If you seek adventure in the Rift, leave the city by Southern Gate and cast your gaze upon the bluff that rises to the south. Atop it sits the Shadow Stone, a fitting symbol for the City of Thieves. Whiterun is the heart of Skyrim, its towering palace rivaling even the great castles of Cyrodiil. But should you tire of the Jarl's hospitality, another adventure awaits a few hours to the east of the city, along the road that rises above White River Gorge. The Ritual Stone can be found atop the lone hill that rises on the north side of the road, set into an ancient monument. Take time to soak in the incredible view of Whiterun, the tundra, and the gorge from this unique spot. More seasoned explorers may wish to visit Markarth, the ancient city of stone far to the west. The recent Forsworn rebellion has made travel in the Reach perilous, but for those determined to seek adventure no matter the cost, another stone can be found to the east of the city, perched on the mountain above Kolseger Mind. Though the climb is difficult, reaching the summit is a milestone any explorer could be proud of. There are other stones of fate to be found in Skyrim. I myself have seen several more, perched on the most remote mountain peaks, or wreathed in fog amid the northern marshes. But the true joy of exploration is in the discovery, and so I leave the rest to you. May the Eight guide your steps. Today's reading: Amongst the Draugr by Bernadette Bantian, College of Winterhold. It wasn't until my 7th month with the creatures that they seemed to accept me. Well, accept isn't really the proper word, but they seemed to have decided that I posed no threat to them, and gradually ceased their attacks. Though more than capable of fending them off, a combination of fire and turning spells are generally sufficient. I admit that I tired of having to be ever vigilant in their presence. I'll never know whether there was some sort of agreement communicated among them, for the only utterances they make seem to be in that heathen tongue that I can't even pronounce, much less transcribe. In time, I learned more of their intentions toward me from their general movements and tones rather than specific words. Hostility in any creature is easily read, but in these most peculiar of living dead, with such variations in gait and speed, what amounts to a hostile charge in one may simply be casual movement in another. The eyes seem to be the key to their intent, and I will confess to more than one dream haunted by the glowing pinpoints in the darkness. I had always wondered why the ancient priests of the dragon cult insisted that their followers be buried with them. It seems that the height of pagan vanity to drag your conscripts to their death along with you, but as I integrated into their presence, I began to observe the reasons. Every day, a set of Draugr would awaken, shamble their way to the sarcophagus of their priest, and prostrate themselves before it. Several hours of this, followed by a meticulous cleaning of the area. It would appear that the adherents of the dragon priest continue their worship of him in death, which would also explain the ferocity with which they defend his chambers. It took several weeks before I felt comfortable approaching the dragon priest's resting place myself. inch by inch, until the snarling draugrs around me seemed to tire of fending off my timid presence. I was able to set some simple scrying spells around the tomb, that I might get a sense of what magical energies resided there. When the next group of draugr came to pay homage to the priest, I noted a sort of transferal happening, a distinct flow of life force between the adherents and the master. It was here that I finally understood the dragon cult's notion of resurrection. The second eternal life was only promised to those who ascended to the priesthood, but the lesser functionaries contributed their life force to sustaining them for eternity. I don't know what sort of eternal wellspring they draw from, but it's clear that draugr carries only the barest whisper of life in it, and rekindles it nightly, while resting in its niche. I now believe that the grotesque forms that we see in the barrows were, in fact, buried fully as men and women, and only over thousands of years that have passed withered into wretched things we know. If we had visited a barrow directly after its construction, we might not have even known any of its inhabitants were dead. These discoveries and extrapolations excite me, and my mind aches to return to the barrows. I have only paused here at the college to transcribe these notes and gather further supplies for a more extended stay. My new hope is to learn some rudimentary way of speaking to them, for imagining what they could tell us of the early mists of time is staggering. Today's reading: An Accounting of the Scrolls by Quintus Nerevillus, former imperial librarian. After the supposed theft of an elder scroll from our imperial library, I endeavored to find any sort of index or catalog of the scrolls in our possession so that such situations could be avoided, or at least properly verified, in the future. To my dismay, I discovered that the moth priests are notoriously inexact when it comes to the actual physical manifestations of the scrolls, and had no idea of how many they held, or how they were organized. Merely asking the question evoked chuckles, as if a child was asking why dogs cannot talk. I will confess my jealousy of the ones who can read the scrolls grows, but I am not yet willing to sacrifice my sight to alleged knowledge. The older moth priests I attempt to engage in conversation seem as batty as any other elder who's lost their mind, so I fail to see what wisdom is imparted from the reading. In any case, I set out to create my own index of the Elder Scrolls, in cooperation with the monks. Day by day, we went through the tower halls, with them telling me each general nature of each Elder Scroll, so that I might record its location. Always careful never to glimpse the writings myself, I had only their word to go on. I meticulously drew out a map of the chambers where the scrolls relating to various specific prophecies were located, where particular periods of history were housed. In all, it took nearly a year of plotting, but at least I had rough notes on the entirety of the library to begin my collation. It was here that things began to go amiss. In studying my notes, I found many areas of overlap and outright contradiction. In some cases, different monks would claim the same scroll to be at opposite ends of the tower. I know they have no taste for jesting, or else I would suspect I was being made the fool in some game of theirs. I spoke to one of the older monks to relate my concerns, and he hung his head in sorrow for my wasted time. "Did I not tell you," he coughed, "when you started this, that all efforts would be futile? The scrolls do not exist in countable form." "I had thought you meant there were too many to be counted." "There are, but that is not the least of the complexities." "Turn to the repository behind you and tell me how many scrolls are locked therein." I ran my fingers over the metal casings, tallying each rounded edge that they encountered, I turned back. 14, I said. Hand me the 8th one, he said, reaching out his hand. I guided the cylinder into his palm, and he gave a slight nod to acknowledge it. Now count again. Humoring him, I again passed my hands over the scrolls, but could not believe what I was feeling. Now there were 18, I gasped. The old monk chuckled, his cheeks pushing up his blindfold until it folded over itself. And in fact, he said, there always were. It was then that I enrolled as the oldest novice ever accepted into the cult of the Ancestor Moth. Today's reading, Aedra and Daedra. The designations of gods, demons, Aedra, and Daedra are universally confusing to the layman. They are often used interchangeably. Aedra and Daedra are not relative terms. They are elvish and exact. Azura is the Daedra both in Skyrim and Morrowind. Aedra is usually translated as ancestor, which is as close as Cyrillic can come to this elven concept. Daedra means roughly, not our ancestors. This distinction was crucial to the Dunmer, whose fundamental split in ideology is represented in their mythical genealogy. Aedra are associated with stasis, while Daedra represent change. Aedra created the mortal world and are bound to the earth bones. Daedra, who cannot create, have the power to change. As part of the divine contract of creation, the Aedra can be killed. Witness Lorcan and the Moons. The Protean Daedra, for whom the rules do not apply, can only be banished. Today's reading, A History of Daggerfall, by Odiva Galwood. There is sufficient archaeological evidence for the modern historian to believe that there has been some variety of human settlement in the city-state of Daggerfall, starting at least 1,000 years before recorded history. The first use of the name Daggerfall to refer to the area around the current capital was most probably the 246th year of the First Era. The north half of the Iliac Bay, in fact, all of the current province of High Rock, was conquered by invading Nords who brought a rough sort of civilization with them. One of the first civilized acts the Nords performed was a census, the so-called Book of Life. Listed on page 933 of the book is this entry. North of the highest bluffs, south of the moors, west of the hills, and east of the sea is called Daggerfall. 110 men, 93 women, 13 children under 8 years of age, 58 cows, 7 bulls, 63 chickens, 11 cocks, 38 hogs live here. Nearly 4,000 years after this census was taken, we can see that these 216 people have multiplied heartily. The last census in the year 3E 401 lists the population at over 110,000. It is always difficult to find an exact number, but the capital city of Daggerfall certainly outnumbers her rivals, Sentinel and Wayrest. It has been a consistent, if not actually helpful, amusement of historians to find the origin of place names. Daggerfall, by tradition, is said to refer to the knife the first chieftain threw to form the borders of his lands. But there are other legends that may have equal validity. The Daggerfall entry from the Book of Life actually supports one theory about the reason for Daggerfall's longevity. The people were coastal fishermen, but they also found the land itself sufficiently rich to support raising livestock. This inclination of the early citizenry toward reinforcing their principal products brought stability to a fickle land. Daggerfall thrived during the years of the Skyrim occupancy. When the Wild Hunt killed King Borjos of Winterhold in First Era 369, the Northlands engaged in the War of Secession. and Skyrim, greatly weakened, lost her holdings in High Rock and Morrowind. The Iliac Bay had become important strategically, and Daggerfall began to expand her military. There were multiple opportunities for her to exercise this army and navy during the Drenni conflicts with the force of the Elysian Reform. The Durennis were native Bretons, and Bretons are hardly ever given it to excessive religion. Daggerfall became a minor base of operations for the Durennis and their allies. Raven Durenni, the enchantress whose magic helped secure the final victory over the Alessians in the Glenumbria Moors, was one of the earliest occupants of the castle Daggerfall. Over the centuries that followed, the Durennis fell into obscurity, but Daggerfall continued her growth. In First Era 609, King Thagor of Daggerfall defeated the army of Glenpoint and became the preeminent economic, cultural, and military force in southern High Rock, a position the kingdom has precariously kept ever since. Ironically, it was another successful military exercise 370 years later that ended Daggerfall's monopoly of bay trade, the annihilation of the Orcish capital Orsinium by a joint effort of Daggerfall, the new kingdom of Sentinel, and the now extinct Order of Diagna. The scattering of the orcs from southeastern High Rock made the river route to the bay more accessible. The tiny village of Wayrest grew like a flower that no longer feared the mow. In 20 years, Wayrest's trade profits equaled Daggerfall's. In 40 years, Wayrest was the acknowledged master of Iliac Bay trade. In 120 years, Wayrest became the Kingdom of Wayrest. The Kingdom of Sentinel did not exhibit Wayrest's aggrandizement during the First Era. The Red Guards were warriors learning the ways of the merchants, and their land was enemy enough to keep their population checked. Indeed, the number of people in all areas of Iliac Bay was halved once in First Era by Thracian plague, once again by the War of Righteousness, and a third time by the invading Akavari. If Daggerfall had not spent its first 1,000 years preparing for the battles of the next 1,000 years, it is indeed conceivable that the Iliac Bay today might be Akavarian. The Second Era, like the latter part of the First Era, is a tapestry of wars, insurrections, and plagues. Daggerfall, Sentinel, and Wayrest continued to expand and improve their military and economic positions in the bay. Daggerfall and Wayrest would transpose positions as major trading center of the bay, and Daggerfall and Sentinel likewise bandied over which was the superior military power. The Iliac Bay has continued to hold an important position in the imperial government of the Third Era. Rarely allies, though the combined armies in opposition to the Cormoran usurper in the 3rd century of the Third Era is a notable exception, but not always enemies. Daggerfall, Sentinel, and Wayrest have weathered the storms of contention, plague, famine, and pestilence. The recent War of Bethany was typical of Iliac Bay warfare, sincere, frighteningly violent, and peaceably resolved. Today's reading: Azadal's Descent by Hayland Greycloak. In the days beyond memory, when men first walked the lands of Skyrim, there arose in the city of Sarthal a great enchanter. As a boy, his gift for magic and artifice had been evident to his tutors. As a man, his skill surpassed them all, and finding nothing more to learn among his kin, he left his wife and child and set out to train under the elven masters. A year became 2, then 3, and when finally his path led him back to Sarthal, he found only ruins, for the elves had sacked the city, and all that lived there were dead or gone. Amid the ashes, in the smoldering ruins of his home, he swore a terrible oath of vengeance, and from that comes the name of the legends give him, Azadal, the embittered destroyer. Alone he could do nothing, and so he bided his time, delving deeper into his art than any before him. From the Dwemer, he learned the 7 natures of metal and how to harmonize them. From the Aelids, the ancient ruins and dawn magic even the elves had begun to forget. Among Falmer and Chimer and Altmer he traveled, taking what he could from each, and all the while plotting how he might turn that knowledge against them. Finally, word reached him of Ysgramor and his companions, newly arrived from Atmora. For 3 days and nights he rode north, and met them as they made landfall on the icy coast near the ruins of Sarthal, which the elves had fortified against them. He offered the companions his service, and all he had produced in his years of labor. And with Atmoran steel, imbued with his enchantments, the elves fell before them, and at last he had his revenge. But he was not content. His craft had become his life, and hunger for knowledge still gnawed at him, driving him to delve even deeper. At long last, he exhausted the lore of the elves, but it was not enough. He sought the secrets of dragon runes, and won for himself a seat among their high priests, but it was not enough. And at length he turned his gaze to the plains of oblivion, and found there both power and madness. Some say he ventured there, never to return. Others, that he was betrayed by his fellow dragon priests and killed, or driven into hiding in the ruins beneath his beloved Sarthal. Among the skull of Solstheim, it is said he fled to their island, and was sealed in the depths of Kolbjorn Barrow, together with the last of his relics. But that is the tale, as it was told among the bards of Winterhold. Whatever the truth, the legend of Azadal was intended as a warning. In pursuit of perfection, one must take care that the pursuit itself does not become all-consuming. Today's reading: Ancestors and the Dunmer. Ghosts walk among them. The departed spirits of the Dunmeri, and perhaps those of all races, persist after death. The knowledge and power of departed ancestors benefits the bloodlines of Dunmeri houses. The bond between the living family members and immortal ancestors is partly blood, partly ritual, partly volitional. A member brought into the house through marriage binds himself through ritual and oath into the clan, and gains communication and benefits from the clan's ancestors. However, his access to the ancestors is less than his offspring, and he retains some access to the ancestors of his own bloodline. The family shrine. Each residence has a family shrine. In poorer homes, it may be no more than a hearth or alcove where the family relics are displayed and venerated. In wealthy homes, a room is set aside for the use of the ancestors. This shrine is called the Waiting Door and represents the door to oblivion. Here the family members pay their respects to their ancestors through sacrifice and prayer, through oaths sworn upon duties, and through reports on the affairs of the family. In return, the family may receive information, training, and blessings from the family's ancestors. The ancestors are thus the protectors of the home, and especially the precincts of the Waiting Door. The Ghost Fence. It is a family's most solemn duty to make sure their ancestors' remains are interred properly in a city of the dead, such as Necrom. Here, the spirits draw comfort from one another against the chill of the mortal world. However, as a sign of great honor and sacrifice, an ancestor may grant that part of his remains to be retained to serve as part of a ghost fence, protecting the clan's shrine and family precincts. Such an arrangement is often part of the family member's will, that a knucklebone shall be saved out of his remains and incorporated with solemn magic and ceremony into a clan ghost fence. In more exceptional cases, an entire skeleton, or even a preserved corpse, may be bound into a ghost fence. These remains become a beacon and focus for ancestral spirits, and for the spirit of the remains in particular. The more remains used to make a ghost fence, the more powerful the fence is, and the most powerful mortals in life have the most powerful remains. The great ghost fence created by the tribunal to hold back the blight incorporates the bones of many heroes of the temple and of the houses Indoril and Redoran, who dedicated their spirits to the temple and clan as their surrogate families. The ghost fence also contains bones taken from the catacombs of Necrom and the many battlefields of Morrowind. The mortal chill. Spirits do not like to visit the mortal world, and they do so only out of duty and obligation. Spirits tell us that the other world is more pleasant, or at least more comfortable for spirits, than our real world, which is cold, bitter, and full of pain and loss. Mad spirits. Spirits that are forced to remain in our world against their will may become mad spirits or ghosts. Some spirits are bound to this world because of some terrible circumstances of their death, or because of some powerful emotional bond to a person, place, or thing. These are called hauntings. Some spirits are captured and bound to enchanted items by wizards. If the binding is involuntary, the spirit usually goes mad. A willing spirit may or may not retain its sanity, depending on the strength of the spirit and the wisdom of the enchanter. Some spirits are bound against their wills to protect family shrines. This unpleasant fate is reserved for those who have not served the family faithfully in life. Dutiful and honorable ancestral spirits often aid in the capture and binding of wayward spirits. These spirits usually go mad and make terrifying guardians. They are ritually prevented from harming mortals of their clans, but that does not necessarily discourage them from mischievous or peevish behavior. They're exceedingly dangerous for intruders. At the same time, if an intruder can penetrate the spirit's madness and play upon the spirit's resentment of its own clan, the angry spirits may be manipulated. Oblivion. The existence of oblivion is acknowledged by all Tamriel cultures, but there's little agreement on the nature of that other world, other than it is the place where the Aedra and Daedra live, and that communication and travel are possible between this world and Oblivion through magic and ritual. The Dunmer do not emphasize the distinction between this world and Oblivion as do human cultures of Tamriel. They regard our world and the other world as a whole with many paths from one end to the other rather than two separate worlds of different natures with distinct borders. The philosophical viewpoint may account for the greater affinity of elves for magic and its practices. Foreign views of Dunmeri ancestor worship and spirit magic. The Altmeri and Bosmeri cultures also venerate their ancestors, but only by respecting the orderly and blissful passage of these spirits from this world to the next. That is, wood elves and high elves believe it is cruel and unnatural to encourage the spirits of the dead to linger in our world. Even more grotesque and repugnant is the display of the bodily remains of ancestors in ghost fences and ash pits. The presentation of finger bones in a family shrine, for instance, is sacrilegious to the Bosmer, who eat their dead, and barbaric to the Altmer, who inter their dead. The human cultures of Tamriel are ignorant and fearful of dark elves and their culture, considering them to be inhuman and evil, like orcs and Argonians, but more sophisticated. The human populations of Tamriel associate Dunmeri ancestor worship with spirit magic, with necromancy. In fact, this association of dark elves with necromancy is at least partly responsible for the dark reputation of Dunmer throughout Tamriel. This is generally an ignorant misconception, for necromancy, outside the acceptable clan rituals, is a most abhorrent abomination in the eyes of the Dunmer. The Dark Elves, who would never think of practicing sorcerous necromancy upon any Dark Elf or upon the remains of any elf, however, Dark Elves consider the human and orcish races to be little more than animals. There is no injunction against necromancy upon such remains, or on the remains of any animal, bird, or insect. Imperial policy officially recognizes the practices of Dunmeri ancestor veneration and spirit magic as a religion, and protects their freedom to pursue such practices so long as they do not threaten the security of the Empire. Privately, most Imperial officials and traders believe Dark Elf ancestor worship and displays of remains are barbaric or even necromantic. Telvanni necromancy. The Telvanni are adept masters of necromancy. They do not, however, practice necromancy upon the remains of Dark Elves. Sane Telvanni regard such practices with loathing and righteous anger. They do practice necromancy upon the remains of animals, and upon remains of humans, orcs, and Argonians, who are technically no more than animals in Morrowind. Publisher's note: this book was written by an unknown scholar as a guide for foreign visitors to Morrowind, shortly after the armistice was signed. Many of these practices have since fallen into disfavor. The most obvious changes are those regarding the practice of necromancy and the Great Ghost Fence. Dunmer today regard necromancy upon any of the accepted races as an abomination. The Ghost Fence has forced many changes in the practice of ancestor worship, with the vast majority of ancestors' remains going to strengthen the Great Ghost Fence around the mountain of Dagothr, where very few clan ghost fences in Morrowind. The temple discourages such practices among the houses are selfish. The upkeep of family tombs and private waiting doors has also fallen into disfavor, as very few remains have been buried in those tombs and shrines since armistice. In recent years, most Dunmer venerate a small portion of their ancestors' remains kept at a local temple. Today's reading: Azura and the Box by Merobar Sol. Uncle Bar had enjoyed an adventurous youth, but had grown to be a very wise, very old Dwemer, who spent his life searching for the truth and dispelling superstitions. He invented much and created many theorems and logic structures that bore his name. But much of the world still puzzled him, and nothing was a greater enigma to him than the nature of the Aedra and the Daedra. Over the course of his research, he came to the conclusion that many of the gods were entirely fabricated by man and Mer. Nothing, however, was a greater question to Enkelbar. than the limits of divine power? Were the greater beings the masters of the entire world, or did the humbler creatures have the strength to forge their own destinies? As Engelbar found himself nearing the end of his life, he felt he must understand the last basic truth. Among the sage's acquaintances was a holy Chimer priest named Athenic. When the priest was visiting Bathalgzatoms, Engelbar told him he intended to find the nature of divine power. Athenic was terrified and pleaded with his friend not to break his great mystery, but Engelbar was resolute. Finally, the priest agreed to assist out of love for his friend, though he feared the results of this blasphemy. Athenic summoned Azura. After the usual rites by which the priest declared his faith in her powers, and Azura agreed to do no harm to him, Engelbar and a dozen of his students entered the summoning chamber, carrying with them a large box. As we see you in our land, Azura, you are the goddess of the dusk and dawn, and all the mysteries therein, said Engelbar, trying to appear as kindly and obsequious as he could be. It is said that your knowledge is absolute. So it is, smiled the Daedra. You would know, for example, what is in this wooden box, said Engelbar. Azura turned to Athenic, her brow furrowed. The priest was quick to explain. Goddess, this Dwemer is a very wise and respected man. Believe me, please, the intention is not to mock your greatness, but to demonstrate it to this scientist and to the rest of his skeptical race. I have tried to explain your power to him, but his philosophy is such that he must see it demonstrated. If I am to demonstrate my might in a way to bring the Dwemer race to understanding, it might have been a more impressive feat you would have me do, growled Azura, and turned to look Engelbar in the eyes. There is a red-petaled flower in the box. Engelbar did not smile or frown. He simply opened the box and revealed to all that it was empty. When the students turned to look at Azura, she was gone. Only Athenic had seen the goddess's expression before she vanished, and he could not speak. He was trembling so. A curse had fallen. He knew that truly, but even crueler was the knowledge of divine power that had been demonstrated. Engelbar also looked pale, uncertain on his feet, but his face shone with not fear but bliss. The smile of a Dwemer finding evidence for a truth only suspected. 2 of his students supported him, and 2 more supported the priest as they left the chamber. I have studied very much over the years, performed countless experiments, taught myself 1,000 languages, and yet the skill that has taught me the finally truth is the one that I learned when I was but a poor young man, trying only to have enough gold to eat, whispered the sage. As he was escorted up the stairs to his bed, a red flower petal fell from the sleeve of his voluminous robe. Engelbar died that night. A portrait of peace that comes from contented knowledge. Publisher's note. This is another tale whose origin is unmistakably Dwemer. Again, the words of some Aldmeri's translations are quite different, but the essence of the story is the same. The Dunmer have a similar tale about Engelbar, but in the Dunmer version, Azura recognizes the trick and refuses to answer the question. She slays the Dwemer present for their skepticism and curses, and Dunmer for blasphemy. In the Aldmeri's version, Azura is tricked not by an empty box, but by a box containing a sphere which somehow becomes a flat square. Of course, the Aldmeri's version, being a few steps closer to the original Dwemer, are much more difficult to understand. Perhaps this stage magic explanation was added by Gorfellam, because of Fellam's own experience with such tricks in his plays when a mage was not available. Merylbar Sol left even the character of Inkelbar alone, and he represents many Dwemer virtues. His skepticism, while not nearly as absolute as in the Aldmary's version, is celebrated, even though it brings a curse upon the Dwemer and the unnamed house of the poor priest. Whatever the true nature of the gods, and how right or wrong the Dwemer were about them, this tale might explain why the dwarves vanished from the face of Tamriel. Though Inkelbar and his kind may not have intended to mock the Aedra and Daedra, their skepticism certainly offended the divine orders. Today's reading: Arcana Restored, a handbook by Wapna Nuestra. Form the first. Makest thou the manna fountain to be primed with pure gold, for from pure gold only may the humors be rectified, and the pure principles coaxed from the chaos of pure power. Droppest thou then the pure gold upon the surface of the manna fountain? Takest thou exceeding great care to safeguard yourself from the insalubrious tempests of the manna fountain, for through such assaults may one's health be utterly blighted. Form the second. Make sure that thou havest with you this excellent manual, so that thou mightst speak the necessary words straight away and without error, so that thou not in carelessness cause thyself and much else to discorporate and disorder the world with your component humors. Form the third. Take in hand the item to be restored, and hold it forth within the primed fountain, murmuring all the while the appropriate phrases, which are to be learned most expeditiously and faultlessly from this manual, and this manual alone, notwithstanding the vile calumnies of Carlinson and Ratnor, whose bowels are consumed by envy of my great learning, and who do falsely give testament to the efficacies of their own manuals, which are in every way inferior and steeped in error. Form the fourth. Proceed instantly to heal thyself of all injuries, or to avail yourself of the healing powers of the temples and healers, for though the agonies of Manacast must be borne by any who restore a prized arcana to full potency, yet it is not wise that suffering be endured unduly, nor does the suffering in any way render the potency more sublime, notwithstanding the foolish speculations of Carnison and Rator, whose faults and wickednesses are manifest even to the least learned of critics. Today's reading: Avar Stonesinger. Sit quietly, child, and listen, for the story I tell you is a story of the ages. But what is it, grandfather? Is it a story of heroes and beasts? The grandfather looked patiently at the child. He was growing into a fine boy. Soon, he would see the value in the stories, the lessons that were taught to each generation. Just listen, child. Let the story take root in your heart. In a time before now, long before now, when the skull were new, there was a peace in the land. The sun was hot, and the crops grew long, and the people were happy in the peace that the Allmaker provided. But the skull grew complacent and lazy, and they took for granted the lands and all the gifts the Allmaker had given them. They forgot, or chose not to remember, that the adversary is always watching, and that he delights in tormenting the Allmaker and his chosen people. And so, it was that the adversary came to be among the skull. The adversary has many aspects. He appears in the unholy beasts and the incurable plague. At the end of seasons, we will know him as Thartog, the world devourer. But in these ages, he came to be known as the Greedy Man. The Greedy Man, that is what we call him, for to speak his name would certainly bring ruin on the people, lived among the skull for many months. Perhaps he was just a man once, but when the adversary entered into him, he became the Greedy Man, and that is how he is remembered. It came to be one day that the powers of the skull left them. The strength left the arms of the warriors. The shaman could no longer summon the beasts to their side. The elders thought surely the Allmaker was displeased, and some suggested that the Allmaker had left them to forever. It was then that the Greedy Man appeared to them and spoke. "You of the skull have grown fat and lazy. I have stolen the gifts of your Allmaker. I have stolen the oceans, so you will forever know thirst. I have stolen the lands and trees, and the sun, so your crops will wither and die. I have stolen the beasts, so you will go hungry. I have stolen the winds, so you will live without the spirit of the Allmaker. And until one of you can reclaim these gifts, the skull will live in misery and despair, for I am the Greedy Man, and that is my nature." And the Greedy Man disappeared. The members of the skull spoke for many days and nights. They knew that one of them must retrieve the gifts of the Allmaker, but they could not decide who it should be. "I cannot go," said the elder, "for us must stay to lead the skull, and tell our people what is the law." "I cannot go," said the warrior, "for I must protect the skull. My sword will be needed in case the Greedy Man reappears." "I cannot go," said the shaman, "for the people need my wisdom. I must read the portents and offer my knowledge." It was then that a young man called Avar lifted his voice. He was strong of arm and fleet of foot, though he was not yet a warrior of the skull. "I will go," said Avar, and the skull laughed. "Hear me out," the boy continued. "I am not yet a warrior, so my sword will not be needed. I cannot read the portents, so the people will not seek my counsel. I am young and not yet wise in the ways of the law. I will retrieve the gifts of the Allmaker from the Greedy Man. If I cannot, I will not be missed." The skull thought on this briefly, and decided to let Avar go. He left the village the next morning to retrieve the gifts. Avar first set out to retrieve the gift of water, so he traveled to the water stone. It was there the Allmaker first spoke to him. "Travel west to the sea, and follow the swimmer to the waters of life." So Avar walked to the edge of the ocean, and there was a swimmer, a black horker, sent from the Allmaker. The swimmer dove into the waters and swam very far and far again. Avar was strong, though, and he swam hard. He followed the swimmer to a cave, swimming deeper and deeper, his lungs burning and his limbs exhausted. At last he found a pocket of air, and there, in the dark, he found the waters of life. Gathering his strength, he took the waters and swam back to shore. Upon returning to the water stone, the Allmaker spoke. "You have returned the gift of water to the skull. The oceans again will bear fruit, and their thirst will be quenched." Avar then traveled to the earth stone, and there the Allmaker spoke to him again. enter the cave of the hidden music, and hear the song of the earth. So Avar traveled north and east to the cave of the hidden music. He found himself in a large cavern, where the rocks hung from the ceiling and grew from the ground itself. He listened there, and heard the song of the earth, but it was faint. Grabbing up his mace, he struck the rocks on the floor in time with the song, and the song grew louder, until it filled the cavern and his heart. Then he returned to the earth stone. "The gift of the earth is with the skull again," said the Allmaker. "The lands are rich again, and will bear life." Avar was tired. As the sun burned him, the trees offered no shade, and there was no wind to cool him. Still, he traveled on to the beast rock, and the Allmaker spoke. "Find the good beast and ease his suffering." Avar traveled through the woods of Sinfir for many hours until he heard the cries of a bear from over a hill. As he crested a hill, he saw the bear, a falmer's arrow piercing its neck. He checked the woods for the falmer, for that is what they were, though some say they are not, and finding none, approached the beast. He spoke soothing words and came upon it slowly, saying, "Good beast, I mean you no harm. The Allmaker has sent me to ease your suffering." Hearing these words, the bear ceased his struggles and laid his head at Avar's feet. Avar grasped the arrow and pulled it from the bear's neck. Using the little nature magic he knew, Avar tended the wound, though it took the last bit of his strength. As the bear's wound closed, Avar slept. When he awoke, the bear stood over him, and the remains of a number of the falmer were strewn about. He knew that the good beast had protected him during the night. He traveled back to Beast Rock, the bear by his side, and the Allmaker spoke to him again. "You have returned the gift of the beast. Once again, the good beasts will feed the skull when they are hungry, clothe them when they are cold, and protect them in times of need." Avar's strength had returned, so he traveled on to the tree stone, though the good beast did not follow him. When he arrived, the Allfather spoke to him. "The first trees are gone and must be replanted. Find the seed and plant the first tree." Avar traveled again through the Hirstang forest, searching for the trees of the first tree, but he could find none. Then he spoke to the tree spirits, the living trees. They told him that the seeds had been stolen by one of the falmer, for they are the servants of the adversary, and this falmer was hiding them deep in the forest, so that none would ever find them. Avar traveled to the deepest part of the forest, and there he found the evil falmer, surrounded by the lesser tree spirits. Avar could see that the spirits were in his thrall, that he had used the magic of the seeds and spoken their secret name. Avar knew he could not stand against such a force, and that he must retrieve the seeds in secret. Avar reached into his pouch and drew out his flint. Gathering leaves, he started a small fire outside the clearing where the falmer and his ensorcelled spirits milled. All the skull knew the spirits' hatred of fires, for the fires ravaged the trees they serve. At once the nature of the spirits took hold, and they rushed to quell the flames. During the commotion, Avar snuck behind the falmer and snatched the pouch of seeds, stealing away before the evil being knew they were gone. When Avar returned to the tree stone, he planted the tree in the ground, and the Allmaker spoke to him. "The gift of trees is restored. Once again, the trees and plants will bloom and grow, and provide nourishment and shade." Avar was tired, for the sun would only burn, and the winds would not yet cool him. But he rested briefly in the shade of the trees. His legs were weary and his eyes heavy, but he continued on, traveling to the sunstone. Again the Allmaker spoke. "The gentle warmth of the sun is stolen, so now it only burns. Free the sun from the halls of penumbra. And so Avar walked west over the frozen lands until he reached the halls of penumbra. The air inside was thick and heavy, and he could see no farther than the end of his arm. Still, he felt his way along the walls, though he heard the shuffling of feet and knew that his place held the unholy beasts who would tear his flesh and eat his bones. For hours he crept along, until he saw a faint glow far at the end of the hall. There, from behind a sheet of perfect ice, came a glow so bright he had to shut his eyes, lest they be forever blinded. He plucked the flaming eye from one of the unholy beasts and threw it at the ice with all his might. A small crack appeared in the ice, then grew larger. Slowly, the light crept out between the cracks, widening them, splitting the ice wall into pieces. With a deafening crack, the wall crumbled, and the light rushed over Avar and through the halls. He heard the shrieks of the unholy beasts as they were blinded and burned. He ran out of the halls, following the light, and collapsed on the ground outside. When he was able to rise again, the sun warmed him, and he was glad for that. He traveled back to the Sunstone, where the Allmaker spoke to him. The gift of the sun is the skulls once again. It will warm them and give them light. Avar had one final gift he had to recover, the gift of the winds. So he traveled to the Windstone far on the western coast of the island. When he arrived, the Allmaker spoke to him, giving him his final task. Find the greedy man, and release the wind from its captivity. So Avar wandered the land in search of the greedy man. He looked in the trees, but the greedy man did not hide there. Nor did he hide near the oceans, or the deep caves, and the beasts had not seen him in the dark forests. Finally, Avar came to a crooked house, and he knew that there he would find the greedy man. "Who are you," shouted the greedy man, "that you would come to my house?" "I am Avar of the Skull," said Avar. "I am not a warrior, shaman, or elder. If I do not return, I will not be missed. But I have returned the oceans, and the earth, and the trees, the beasts, and the sun, and I will return the winds to my people, that we may feel the spirit of Allmaker in our souls again." And with that, he grabbed up the greedy man's bag and tore it open. The winds rushed out with gale force, sweeping the greedy man up and carrying him off far from the island. Avar breathed in the winds and was glad. He walked back to the Windstone, where the Allmaker spoke to him a final time. "You have done well, Avar. You, the least of the Skull, have returned my gifts to them. The greedy man is gone for now, and should not trouble your people again in your lifetime. Your Allmaker is pleased. Go now and live according to your nature." And Avar started back to the Skull Village. "And then what happened, grandfather?" "What do you mean, child? He went home." "No. When he returned to the village," the child continued. "Was he a warrior? Or taught the ways of the shaman? Did he lead the skull in battle?" "I do not know. That is where the story ends," said the grandfather. "But that is not an ending. That's not how the stories end." The old man laughed and got up from his chair. "Is it not?" Today's reading: The Battle of Red Mountain and the Rise and Fall of the Tribunal. The following is a transcript of the words of Lord Vivek addressed to a dissident priest, Malur Omain, who confronted Vivek in the Ashlander traditions surrounding the Battle of Red Mountain and with prophecies of the Nerevarine, and to unnamed magistrates of the Inquisition who joined Vivek into interrogating the dissident priest. Who can clearly recall the events of the distant past? But you have asked me to tell you, in my own words, the events surrounding the Battle of Red Mountain, the birth of the Tribunal, and the prophecies of a Nerevar reborn. Here is what I can tell you. When the Chimer first abandoned the herds and tents of their nomadic ancestors, and built the first great houses, we loved the Daedra and worshipped them as gods. But our brethren, the Dwemer, scorned the Daedra, and mocked our foolish rituals, and preferred instead their gods of reason and logic. So the Chimer and Dwemer were always at bitter war, until the Nords came and invaded Residane. Only then did the Chimer and Dwemer put away their strife and join together to cast out the invaders. Once the Nords were driven out, General Nerevar of the Chimer and General Dumak of the Dwemer, who had come to love and respect one another, resolved to make peace between their peoples. In that time I was but a junior counselor to Nerevar, and Nerevar's queen, Almalexia, and his other favorite counselor, Sothasil, always doubted that such a peace might long survive, given the bitter disputes between Chimer and Dwemer. But by negotiation and compromise, Nerevar and Dumak somehow managed to preserve a fragile peace. But when Dogoth-Ur, Lord House of Dagoth, and trusted as friend by both Nerevar and Dwemer, brought us proof that High Engineer Karanak of the Dwemer had discovered the heart of Lorkhan, and that he had learned how to tap its powers and was building a new god, a mockery of Chimer faith, and a fearsome weapon, we all urged Nerevar to make war on the dwarves, and to destroy this threat to Chimer beliefs and security. Nerevar was troubled. He went to Dumak, and asked if what Dagoth-Ur said was true. But Karanak took great offense, and asked whom Nerevar thought he was, that he might presume to judge the affairs of the Dwemer. Nerevar was further troubled, and made pilgrimage to Holomaion, the sacred temple of Azura, and Azura confirmed that all that Dagoth-Ur said was indeed true, and that the creation of a new god of the Dwemer should be prevented at all costs. When Nerevar came back and told us what the goddess had said, we felt our judgments confirmed and again counseled him to war, chiding Nerevar for his naive trust and friendship, and reminding Nerevar of his duty to protect the faith and security of Chimer against the impiety and dangerous ambitions of the Dwemer. When Nerevar went back to Vardenfell one last time, hoping that negotiations and compromise might once again preserve the peace, but this time the friends Nerevar and Dumak quarreled bitterly, and as a result the Chimer and Dwemer went to war. The Dwemer were well defended by their fortresses at Red Mountain, but Nerevar's cunning drew most of Dumak's armies out into the field and pinned them there, while Nerevar, Dagoth-Ur, and a small group of companions could make their way into the heart chamber by secret means. There, Nerevar, the Chimer king, met Dumak the dwarf king, and they both collapsed from grievous wounds and draining magics. With Dumak fallen, and threatened by Dagoth-Ur and others, Karanak turned his tools upon the heart, and Nerevar said he saw Karanak and all his Dwemer companions at once disappear from the world. In that instant, Dwemer everywhere disappeared without a trace. But Karanak's tools remained, and Dagoth-Ur seized them, and he carried them to Nerevar, saying, "That fool Karanak has destroyed his own people with these things. We should destroy them right away, lest they fall into the wrong hands." But Nerevar was resolved to confer with his queen and his generals, who had foreseen that this war would come and whose counsel he would not ignore again. "I will ask the tribunal what we shall do with them, for they have had wisdom in the past that I had not. Stay here, loyal Dagoth-Ur, until I return." So Nerevar told Dagoth-Ur to protect the tools and the heart chamber until he returned. Then Nerevar was carried to us, where we waited on the slopes of the Red Mountain, and he told us all that that had transpired under Red Mountain. What Nerevar had said was that the Dwemer had used special tools to turn their people into immortals, and that the heart of Lorcan held wondrous powers. Only later did we hear from others present that Dagoth had thought the Dwemer destroyed, not made immortal, and no one knows for sure what really happened there. After hearing Nerevar, we gave our counsel as he requested, proposing, we should preserve these tools in trust for the welfare of the Chimer people, and who knows, perhaps the Dwemer are not gone forever, but merely transported to some distant realm, from which they may someday return to threaten our security once again. Therefore, we need to keep these tools to study them and their principles, so that we may be safe in future generations. And though Nerevar voiced his grave misgivings, he was willing to be ruled by our council under one condition, that we all together should swear a solemn oath upon Azura that the tools would never be used in the profane manner that the Dwemer had intended. We all readily agreed, and swore solemn oaths at Nerevar's dictation. So then we went with Nerevar back into Red Mountain and met with Dagoth. Dagoth refused to deliver the tools to us, saying they were dangerous and we could not touch them. Dagoth seemed to be irrational, insisting that only he could be trusted with the tools, and then we guessed that he had somehow been affected by his handling of the tools, but now I feel sure that he had privately learned the powers of the tools, and had in some confused way decided he must have them for himself. Then, Nerevar our guard resorted to force to secure the tools. Somehow Dagoth and his retainers escaped, but we gained the tools and delivered them to Sothasil for study and safekeeping. For some years we kept the oaths, and we swore to Azura with Nerevar, but during that time in secret, Sothasil must have studied the tools and divined their mysteries. And at last he came to us with a vision of a new world of peace, with justice and honor for nobles, and health and prosperity for the commoners, with the tribunal as immortal patrons and guides. And dedicating ourselves to this vision of a better world, we made a pilgrimage to Red Mountain and transformed ourselves with the power of Karanak's tools. And no sooner than we had completed our rituals and begun to discover our newfound powers, the Daedra Lord Azura appeared and cursed us for our forsworn oaths. By her powers of prophecy, she assured us that her champion, Nerevar, true to his oath, would return to punish us for our perfidy, and to make sure such profane knowledge might never again be used to mock and defy the will of the gods. But Sothasil said to her, the old gods are cruel and arbitrary, and distant from the hopes and fears of Mer. Your age is past. We are the new gods, born of the flesh, and wise in caring of the needs of our people. Spare us your threats and chiding inconsistent spirit. We are bold and fresh, and will not fear you. And then in that moment, all Chimer were changed into Dunmer, and our skins turned ashen, and our eyes into fire. Of course, we only knew at that time that this had happened to us, but Azura said, this is not my act, but your act. You have chosen your fate, and the fate of your people, and all the Dunmer shall share your fate. From now to the end of time, you think yourselves gods, but you are blind, and all is darkness. And Azura left us alone, in darkness, and we were all afraid. But we put on brave faces, and went forth from Red Mountain to build our new world of our dreams. And the new world we shaped was glorious and generous, and the worship of the Dunmer fervent and grateful. The Dunmer were at first afraid of their new faces, but Sothasil spoke to them, saying that it was not a curse but a blessing, a sign of their changed natures, and a sign of the special favor they might enjoy as new Mer, no longer barbarians trembling before the ghosts and spirits, but civilized Mer, speaking directly to their immortal friends and patrons, the three faces of the tribunal. And we were all inspired by Sothasil's speech and vision, and took heart, and over time we crafted the customs and institutions of a just and honorable society, and the Lord of Residon knew millennia of peace, equity, and prosperity unknown to other savage races. But beneath Red Mountain, Dagothr had survived, and even as the light of our bold new world shined ever more brightly, beneath Red Mountain the darkness gathered, a darkness that was close kin to the bright light that so the seal coast from the heart of Lorcan with the tools of Karanak. As the darkness grew, we fought it, and crafted walls to confine it, but we never could destroy it, for the source of the darkness was the same source as the source of our own divine inspiration. And in these latter days of Morrowind, reduced to a subjugated province of the Western Empire, as the glory of the temple fades and the dark tide rises from Red Mountain, we are reminded of Azura and her promised champion's return. We have waited, blind, and in darkness, mere shadows, drained of our ardent vision, in shame of our folly, in fear of our judgment, and in hope of our deliverance. We do not know if the Outlander, claiming to fulfill the prophecies of Nerevarine, is our old companion Nerevar reborn, or a pawn of the Emperor, or a cat's paw of Azura, or some simple twist of fate. But we insist you adhere to the temple doctrine, and conform to the strictures dividing the hieroglypha from the apocrypha, and that you not speak that which must not be spoken openly. Act as a dutiful priest should, in accordance with your vows of obedience to the canons and archcanons, and all will be forgiven. Defy me, and you will know what it is to stand against a god. Vivek. Today's reading: Argonian Account by Wayan Jarth. On a minor but respectable plaza in the Imperial sat, or perhaps lounged, Lord Vanek's building commission. It was an unimaginative, austere building, not noted so much for its aesthetic or architectural design as for its prodigious length. If any critics wondered why such an unornamented, extended erection held such fascination for Lord Vanek, they kept it to themselves. In the 398th year of the Third Era, Decimus Scotti was a senior clerk at the Commission. It had been a few months since the shy middle-aged man had brought Lord Vanek the most lucrative of all contracts, granting the Commission the exclusive right to rebuild the roads of Valenwood, which had been destroyed in the 5-Year War. For this, he had become the darling of the managers and the clerks, spending his days recounting his adventures more or less faithfully, although he did omit the ending of the tale, since many of them had partaken in the celebratory Unthrapa roast, provided by the Salenstri. Informing one's listeners that they've gorged on human flesh improves very few stories in any good taste. Scotty was neither particularly ambitious nor hard-working, so he did not mind that Lord Vanek had not given him anything to actually do. Whatever the squat little gnomish man would happen upon Decimus Scotti in the offices, Lord Vanek would always say, "You're a credit to the Commission. Keep up the good work." In the beginning, Scotty had worried that he was supposed to be doing something, but as the months went on, he merely replied, "Thank you, I will." There was, on the other hand, the future to consider. He was not a young man, and though he was receiving a respectable salary for someone not doing actual work, Scotty considered that soon he might have to retire and not get paid for not doing work. It would be nice, he decided, if Lord Vanek, out of gratitude for the millions of gold the Valenwood contract was generating, might deign to make Scotty a partner, or at least give him a small percentage of the bounty. Decimus Scotti was no good at asking for things like that, which was one of the reasons why, previous to his signal success in Valenwood as a senior clerk for Lord Atreus, he was a lousy agent. He had just about made up his mind to say something to Lord Vanek when his lordship unexpectedly pushed things along. You're a credit to the commission, the waddling little thing said, and then paused. Do you have a moment free on your schedule? Scotty nodded eagerly and followed his lordship to his hideously decorated and very enviable hectare of office space. Zenithar blesses us for your presence at the commission, the little fellow squeaked grandly. I don't know whether you know this, but we were having a bad time before you came along. We had impressive projects for certain, but they were not successful. In Black Marsh, for example, for years we've been trying to improve the roads and outer routes of travel for commerce. I put my best man, Fleecis Tio, on it, but every year, despite staggering investments of time and money, the trade along those routes only gets slower and slower. Now we have your very clean, very profitable Valenwood contract to boost the Commission's profits. I think it's time you were rewarded. Scotty grinned a grin of great modesty and subtle avarice. I want you to take over the Black Marsh account from Fleecis Tio. Scotty shook as if awakening from a pleasant dream to a hideous reality. My lord, I couldn't. Nonsense, chirped Lord Vanek. Don't worry about Tio. He will be happy to retire on the money I give him, particularly as soul-wrenchingly difficult as this Black Marsh business has been. Just your sort of challenge, my dear Decimus. Scotty couldn't utter a sound. Through his mouth feebly formed the word no, as Lord Vanek brought out the box of documentation on Black Marsh. You're a fast reader, Lord Vanek guessed. You can read it all en route. En route to Black Marsh, of course, the tiny fellow giggled. You are a funny chap. Where else would you go to learn about the work that's being done, and how to improve it? The next morning, the stack of documentation hardly touched. Decimus Scotty began the journey southeast to Black Marsh. Lord Vanek had hired an able-bodied guard, a rather taciturn red guard named Malik, to protect his best agent. They rode south along the Niben, and then southeast along the Silverfish, continuing on into the wilds of Cyrodiil, where the river tributaries had no names, and the very vegetation seemed to come from another world than the nice, civilized gardens of the North Imperial Province. Scotty's horse was tied to Malik's, so the clerk was able to read. It made it difficult to pay attention to the path they were taking, but Scotty knew he needed at least a cursory familiarity with the Commission's business dealings in Black Marsh. It was a huge box of paperwork going back 40 years, when the Commission had first been given several million in gold by a wealthy trader, Lord Zealousys Pinos Revena, to improve the condition of the road from Gideon to Cyrodiil. At that time, it took 3 weeks, a preposterously long time, for the rice and fruit he was importing to arrive, half-rotten, in the imperial province. Pinos Revena was long dead, but many other investors over the decades, including Pelagius IV himself, had hired the Commission to build roads, drain swamps, construct bridges, devise anti-smuggling systems, hire mercenaries, and in short, do everything that the greatest empire in history knew would work to aid trade with Black Marsh. According to the latest figures, the result of this was that it took 2.5 months for goods, now thoroughly rotten, to arrive. Scotty found that when he looked up after concentrating on what he was reading, the landscape had always changed, always dramatically, always for the worst. This is Blackwood, sir, said Malik to Scotty's unspoken question. It was dark and woodsy, so Decimus Scotty thought that a very appropriate name. The question he longed to ask, which in due course he did ask, was, "What's that terrible smell?" "Slough Point, sir," Malik replied as they turned the next bend, where the umbrageous tunnel of tangled tree and vine opened to a clearing. There squatted a cluster of formal buildings in the dreary imperial design favored by Lord Vannick's commission, and every emperor since Tiber, together with a stanch so eye-bindingly, stomach-wrenchingly awful that Scotty wondered suddenly if it were deadly poisonous. The swarms of blood-colored, sand-grain-sized insects obscuring the air did not improve the view. Scotty and Malik batted at the buzzing clouds as they rode their horses towards the largest of the buildings, which on approach revealed itself to be perched at the edge of a thick, black river. From its size and serious aspect, Scotty guessed it to be the census and excise office for the wide, white bridge that stretched across the burbling dark water to the reeds on the other side. It was a very nice, bright, sturdy-looking bridge, built, Scotty knew, by his commission. A poxy, irritable official opened the door quickly on Scotty's first knock. Come in, quickly. Don't let the flesh flies in." "Flesh flies?" Decimus Scotty trembled. "You mean they eat human flesh?" "If you're fool enough to stand around and let them," the soldier said, rolling his eyes. He had half an ear, and Scotty looked around at the other soldiers in the fort, noted that they were all well chewed. One of them had no nose at all to speak of. "Now, what's your business?" Scotty told them, and added that if they stood outside the fortress instead of inside, they might catch more smugglers. "You better be more concerned with getting across that bridge," the soldier sneered. "Tide's coming up, and if you don't get a move on, you won't get to Black Marsh for 4 days." That was absurd. A bridge swamped by a rising tide on a river? Only the look in the soldier's eyes told Scotty he wasn't joking. Upon stepping out of the fort, he saw that the horses, evidently tired of being tortured by the flesh flies, had ripped free of their restraints and were bounding off into the woods. The oily water of the river was already lapping on the planks, oozing between the crevices. Scotty reflected that perhaps he would be more than willing to endure a wait of 4 days before going to Black Marsh. But Malik was already running across. Scotty followed him wheezing. He was not in excellent shape, and had never been. The box of commission materials was heavy. Halfway across, he paused to catch his breath, and then discovered he could not move. His feet were stuck. The black mud that ran through the river was a thick, gluey paste, and having washed over the planks Scotty was on, it held his feet fast. Panic seized him. Scotty looked up from his trap and saw Malik leaping from plank to plank ahead of him, closing fast on the reeds on the other side. "Help," Scotty cried. "I'm stuck." Malik did not even turn around, but kept jumping. "I know, sir. You need to lose weight." Decimus Scotty knew he was a few pounds over, and had meant to start eating less and exercising more, but embarking on a diet hardly seemed to promise timely aid in his current predicament. No diet on Nirn would have helped him just then. However, on reflection, Scotty realized that the Red Guard intended that he drop the box of documents, for Malik was no longer carrying any of the essential supplies he had had with him previously. With a sigh, Scotty threw the box of commission notes into the glop, and felt it plank under him, rise a 1/4 of an inch, just enough to free him from the mud's clutches. With an agility born of extreme fear, Scotty began leaping after Malik, dropping out every 3rd plank and springing up before the river gripped him. In 46 leaps, Decimus Scotty crashed through the reeds into the solid ground behind Malik and found himself in Black Marsh. He could hear behind him a slurping sound as the bridge and his container of important and official records of commission affairs was consumed by the rising flood of dark filth, never to be seen again. Today's reading: Argonian Account, Book 2. Decimus Scotti emerged from the dirt and reeds, exhausted from running, his face and arms sheathed in red flesh flies. Looking back toward Cyrodiil, he saw the bridge disappear beneath the thick black river, and he knew he was not getting back until the tide went down in a few days' time. The river also held in its adhesive depths his files on the Black Marsh account. He would have to rely on his memory for his contacts in Gideon. Malik was purposefully striding through the reeds ahead, flailing ineffectually at the flesh flies. Scotti hurried after him. "We're lucky, sir," said the Red Guard, which struck Scotti as an extraordinarily odd thing to say, until his eyes followed where the man's finger was pointing. "The caravan is here." 21 rusted, mud-spattered wagons with rotting wood and wobbly wheels sat half-sunk in the soft earth ahead. A crowd of Argonians, gray-scaled and gray-eyed, the sort of sullen manual laborers that were common in Cyrodiil, pulled at one of the wagons, which had been detached from the others. As Scotti and Malik came closer, they saw it was filled with a cargo of black berries, so decayed that they had become hardly recognizable, more a festering jelly than a wagon-load of fruit. Yes, they were going to the city of Gideon, and yes, they said, Scotti could get a ride with them after they were finished unloading the shipment of lumberries. "How long ago were they picked?" Scotti asked, looking in the wagon's rotten produce. The harvest was in the last seed, of course," said the Argonian who seemed to be in charge of the wagon. It was now the sun's dusk, so they had been en route from the fields for a little over 2 months. Clearly, Scotti thought, there were problems with transportation, but fixing that, after all, was what he was doing here as a representative of Lord Vanek's building commission. It took close to an hour of the berries rotting even more in the sun for the wagon to be pushed to the side, the wagons in front of it and behind it to be attached to one another, and one of the 8 horses from the front of the caravan to be brought around to the now independent wagon. The laborers moved with a dispirited lethargy, and Scotti took the opportunity to inspect the rest of the caravan and talk to his fellow travelers. 4 of the wagons had benches in them, fit for uncomfortable riders. All the rest were filled with grain, meat, and vegetation in various stages of corruption. The travelers consisted of the 6 Argonian laborers, 3 imperial merchants, so bug-bitten that their skin looked as scaly as the Argonians themselves, and 3 cloaked fellows who were evidently Dunmer, judging by the red eyes that gleamed in the shadows under their hoods. All were transporting their goods along the Imperial Commerce Road. "This is a road?" Scotti exclaimed, looking at the endless fields of reeds that had reached up to his chin or higher. "It's solid ground of a sort," one of the hooded Dunmer shrugged. "The horses eat some of the reed, and sometimes we set fire to it, but it just grows right back up." Finally, the wagon master signaled that the caravan was ready to go, and Scotti took the seat in the 3rd wagon with the other Imperials. He looked around, but Malik was not on board. "I agreed to get you to Black Marsh and take you back out," said the Red Guard, who had plumped down a rock in the sea of reeds and was munching on a hairy carrot. "I'll be here when you get back." Scotti frowned, and not only because Malik had dropped the deferential title Sir while addressing him. Now he truly knew no one in Black Marsh, but the caravan slowly grinded and bumped forward, so there was no time to argue. A noxious wind blew across the Commerce Road, casting patterns in the endless, featureless expanse of reeds. In the distance there seemed to be mountains, but they constantly shifted and Scotty realized there were banks of mist and fog. Shadows flitted across the landscape, and when Scotty looked up, he saw they were being cast by giant birds with long, saw-like beaks nearly the size of the rest of their bodies. Hackwings. Carogamolus, an imperial on Scotty's left, who might have been young but looked old and beaten, muttered, "Like everything else in this damnable place, they'll eat you if you don't keep moving. Beggars pounce down and give you a nasty chop, and then fly off and come back when you're mostly dead from blood loss." Scotty shivered. He hoped they'd be in Gideon before nightfall. It was then it occurred to him that the sun was on the wrong side of the caravan. "Excuse me, sir," Scotty called to the wagon master. "I thought you said we were going to Gideon." The wagon master nodded. "Why are we going then, north then, when we should be going south?" There was no reply but a sigh. Scotty confirmed with his fellow travelers that they too were going to Gideon, and none of them seemed very concerned about the circuitous route to getting there. The seats were hard on his middle-aged back and buttocks, but the bumping rhythm of the caravan and hypnotic waving reeds gradually had an effect on him, and Scotty drifted off to sleep. He awoke in the dark some hours later, not sure where he was. The caravan was no longer moving, and he was on the floor, under the bench, next to some small boxes. There were voices speaking in hissing, clicking language. Scotty didn't understand, and he peeked out between someone's legs to see what was happening. The moons barely pierced the thick mist surrounding the caravan, and Scotty did not have the best angle to see who was talking. For a moment it looked like the gray wagon master was talking to himself, but the darkness had movement and moisture, in fact, glistening scales. It was hard to tell how many of these things there were, but they were big, black, and the more Scotty looked at them, the more details he could see. When one particular detail emerged, huge mouths filled the dripping needle-like fangs. Scotty slipped back under the bench. Their black little eyes had not fallen on him yet. The legs in front of Scotty moved, and then began to thrash, as their owner was grabbed and pulled out of the wagon. Scotty crouched further back, getting behind the little boxes. He didn't know much about concealment, but had some experience with shields. He knew that having something, anything, in between you and bad things was always good. A few seconds after the legs had disappeared from sight, there was a horrible scream, and then a second, and a third. Different timbres, different accents, but the same inarticulate message. Terror and pain. Horrible pain. Scotty remembered a long-forgotten prayer to the god Stendar and whispered it to himself. Then there was silence. Ghastly silence that lasted only a few minutes, but which seemed like hours, years. And then the carriage started, rolling forward again. Scotty cautiously crawled out from under the carriage. Cairo-Gamulus gave him a bemused grin. "There you are," he said. "I thought the Nagas took you." "Nagas?" "Nasty characters," Gamulus said, frowning. "Puff adders with legs and arms, 7 feet tall, 8 when they're mad. Come from the inner swamp, and they don't like it here so much, so they're particularly peevish. You're the kind of posh imperial they're looking for." Scotty had never in his life thought of himself as posh. His mud and flesh-fly bespeckled clothing seemed eminently middle class at best to him. "What would they want me for?" "To rob, of course," the Imperial smiled. "And to kill. You didn't notice what happened to the others?" The Imperial frowned as if struck by a thought. "You didn't sample from those boxes down below, did you? Like the sugar? Do you?" Gods, no, Scotty grimaced. The Imperial nodded, relieved. You just seem a little slow. First time to Black Marsh, I gather? Oh, hey-ho, hiss-piss. Scotty was just about to ask Gamulus what vulgar term meant when the rain began. It was an inferno of foul-smelling, yellow-brown rain that washed over the caravan, accompanied by the growl of thunder in the distance. Gamulus worked to pull the roof up over the wagon, glaring at Scotty until he helped with the laborious process. He shuddered, not only from the cold damp, but from contemplation of the disgust precipitation pouring down on the already nasty produce in the uncovered wagon. We'll be dry soon enough, Gamulus smiled, pointing out into the fog. Scotty had never been to Gideon, but he knew what to expect. A large settlement more or less laid out like an imperial city, with more or less imperial-style architecture, and all the imperial comforts and traditions, more or less. The jumble of huts half sunk in the mud was decidedly less. Where are we? Asked Scotty, bewildered. Hixenog, replied Gamulus, pronouncing the queer name with confidence. You were right. We were going north when we should have been going south. Today's reading. Argonian Account, Book 3. Decimus Scoti was supposed to be in Gideon, a thoroughly imperialized city in southern Black Marsh, arranging business dealings to improve commerce in the province on behalf of Lord Vennick's building commission and its clients. Instead, he was in a half-submerged, rotten little village called Hixenog, where he knew no one, except for a drug smuggler named Cairo Gamulus. Gamulus is not at all perturbed that the merchant caravan had gone north instead of south. He even let Scotty share his bucket of trod, tiny little crunchy fish he had bought from the villagers. Scotty would have preferred them cooked, or at any rate dead, but Gamulus blithely explained that the dead cooked trod are deadly poison. If I were where I was supposed to be, Scotty pouted, putting one of the wriggling little creatures in his mouth, I could be having a roast and some cheese and a glass of wine. I sell moon sugar in the north and buy it in the south, he shrugged. You have to be more flexible, my friend. My only business is in Gideon, Scotty frowned. Well, you have a couple of choices, replied the smuggler. You could just stay here. Most villages in Argonia don't stay put for very long, and there's a good chance Hixenog will drift right down to the gates of Gideon. Might take you a month or two, probably the easiest way. That'd put me far behind schedule. Next option. You could join up with the caravan again, said Gamulus. They might be going in the right direction this time, and they might not get stuck in the mud, and they might not be all murdered by Nagahaimeli men. Not tempting, Scotty frowned. Any other ideas? Ride the routes. The Underground Express. Gamulus grinned. Follow me. Scotty followed Gamulus out of the village and into a copse of trees shrouded by veils of wispy moss. The smuggler kept his eye on the ground, poking at the viscous mud intermittently. Finally, he found a spot which triggered a mass of big oily bubbles to rise to the surface. Perfect, he said. Now the important thing is not to panic. The express will take you due south, and that's the wintertide migration, and you'll know you're near Gideon when you see a lot of red clay. Just don't panic, and when you see a mass of bubbles, that's a breathing hole you can use to get out. Scotty looked at Gamulus blankly. The man was talking perfect gibberish. What? Gamulus took Scotty by the shoulder and positioning him on top of the mass of bubbles. You stand right here. Scotty sank quickly into the mud, staring at the smuggler, horror-struck. "And remember to wait till you see the red clay, and then the next time you see bubbles, push up." The more Scotty wiggled to get free, the faster he sunk. The mud enveloped Scotty to his neck, and he continued staring, unable to articulate anything but a noise like "oog." "And don't panic at the idea that you're being digested. You could live in a rootworm's belly for months." Scotty took one last panicked gasp of air and closed his eyes before he disappeared into the mud. The clerk felt a warmth he hadn't expected all around him. When he opened his eyes, he found that he was entirely surrounded by a translucent goo and was traveling rapidly forward, southward, gliding through the mud as if it were air, skipping along an intricate network of roots. Scotty felt confusion and euphoria in equal measures, madly rushing forward through an alien environment of darkness, spinning around and over the thick fibrous tentacles of the trees. It was if he were high in the sky at midnight, not deep beneath the swamp in the Underground Express. Looking up slightly at the massive root structure above, Scotty saw something wriggle past, an 8-foot-long armless, legless, colorless, boneless, eyeless, nearly shapeless creature, riding the roots. Something dark was inside of it, and as it came closer, Scotty could see it was an Argonian man. He waved, and the disgusting creature, the Argonian, was flattened slightly and rushed onward. Gamulus's words began to reappear in Scotty's mind at this sight. The wintertide migration, air hole, you're being digested. These were the phrases that danced around as if trying to find some place to live in a brain which was highly resistant to them coming in. But there was no other way to look at the situation. Scotty had gone from eating living fish to being eaten alive as a way of transport. He was in one of those worms. Scotty made an executive decision to faint. He awoke in stages, having a beautiful dream of being held in a woman's warm embrace. Smiling and opening his eyes, the reality of where he really was rushed over him. The creature was still rushing madly, blindly forward, gliding over roots, but it was no longer like a flight through the night sky. Now it was like the sky at sunrise, in pinks and reds. Scotty remembered Gamulus's telling him to look for red clay and he would be near Gideon. The next thing he had to find was the bubbles. There were no bubbles anywhere. Though the inside of the worm was still warm and comfortable, Scotty felt the weight of the earth all around him. "Just don't panic," Gamulus had said. But it was one thing to hear that advice and quite another to take it. He began to squirm, and the creature began to move faster at the increased pressure from within. Suddenly, Scotty saw it ahead of him, a slim spire of bubbles rising up through the mud from some underground stream straight up through the roots to the surface above him. The moment the rootworm went through it, Scotty pushed with all his might upwards, bursting through the creature's thin skin. The bubbles pushed Scotty up quickly, and before he could blink he was popping out of the red slushy mud. 2 gray Argonians were standing under a tree nearby, holding a net. They looked in Scotty's direction with polite curiosity. In their net, Scotty noticed, were several squirming, furry, rat-like creatures. While he addressed them, another fell out of the tree. Though Scotty had not been educated in this practice, he recognized fishing when he saw it. "Excuse me, lads," Scotty said jovially. "I was wondering if you'd point me in the direction of Gideon." The Argonians introduced themselves as Drawing Flame and Furl of Fresh Leaves, and looked at one another, puzzling over the question. "Who you seek?" asked Furl of Fresh Leaves. "I believe his name is," said Scotty, trying to remember the contents of his long-gone file of Black Marsh contacts in Gideon. "Arkeen, Right Foot, Rock?" Drawing Flame nodded. "For 5 gold, show you way. Just east. Is plantation east of Gideon. Very nice." Scotty thought that the best business he had heard of in 2 days, and handed Drawing Flames the 5 septims. The Argonians led Scotty into the muddy ribbon of road that passed through the reeds and soon revealed the bright blue expanse of the Topol Bay far to the west. Scotty looked around at the magnificent walled estates, where bright crimson blossoms sprang forth from the very dirt of the walls, and surprised himself by thinking, "This is very pretty." The road ran parallel to a fast-moving stream, running eastward from Topol Bay. It was called the Oncorbra River, and was told it ran deep into Black Marsh, to the very dark heart of the province. Peeking past the gates to the plantations east of Gideon, Scotty saw the few of the fields that were tended. Most had rotten crops from harvest past still clinging to wilted vines, orchards of desolate leafless trees. The Argonian serfs who worked the fields were thin, weak, near death, more like haunting spirits than creatures of life and reason. 2 hours later, as the three continued their trudge east, the estates were still impressive, at least from a distance. The road was still solid if weedy, but Scotty was irritated, horrified by the field workers and the agricultural state, and no longer charitable towards the area. How much further? Furl of Fresh Leaves and Drawing Flame looked at one another, as if that question was something that hadn't occurred to them. "Arcane is east?" Furl of Fresh Leaves pondered. "Near or far?" Drawing Flame shrugged, non-committally, and said, "Scotty, for 5 gold, show you way. Just east is plantation. Very nice." "You don't have any idea, do you?" Scotty cried. "Why couldn't you tell me that in the first place, when I might have asked someone else?" Around the bend up head, there was a sound of hoofbeats, a horse coming closer. Scotty began to walk forwards, towards the sound, to hail the rider, and didn't see Drawing Flame's taloned claws flash out and cast the spell at him. He felt it, though, a kiss of ice along his spine, the muscles along his arms and legs suddenly immobile, as if wrapped in rigid steel. He was paralyzed. The great curse of paralysis, as the reader may be unfortunate enough to know, is that you continue to see and think through your body, though your body does not respond. The thought that went through Scotty's mind was, "Damn." For Drawing Flame and Furl of Fresh Leaves were, of course, like most simple day laborers in Black Marsh, accomplished illusionists, and no friend of the Imperial. The Argonians shoved Decimus Scotty into the side of the road, just as the horse and rider came around the corner. He was an impressive figure, a nobleman in a flashing dark green cloak, the exact same color as his scaled skin, and a frilled hood that was part of his flesh and sat upon his head like a horned crown. "Greetings, brothers," the rider said to the two. "Greetings, Arcane Right-Foot Rock," they responded, and then Furl of Fresh Leaves added, "What is my lord's business on this fine day?" "No rest, no rest," the Arcane sighed regally. "One of my she-workers gave birth to twins. Twins! Fortunately, there's a good trader in town for those, and she didn't put up too much of a fuss. And then there's the fool of an Imperial from Lord Vanek's building commission I'm supposed to meet with in Gideon. I'm sure he'll want the grand tour before he opens up the treasury for me. Such a lot of fuss." Drawing Flame and Furl of Fresh Leaves sympathized. And then, as Arcane Right-Foot Rock rode off, they went to look for their hostage. Unfortunately for them, gravity being the same in Black Marsh as elsewhere in Tamriel, their hostage, Decimus Scotty, had continued to roll down from where they had left him, and was, at that moment, in the Oncorbra River, drowning. Today's reading Argonian Account, Book 4. Decimus Scotti was drowning, and he didn't think much of it. He couldn't move his arms or his legs to swim because of the paralysis spell the Argonian peasant had lobbed at him. But he wasn't quite sinking. The Oncobra River was a crashing force of white water and currents that could carry along large rocks with ease, so Scotti tumbled head over heels, spinning, bumping, bouncing along. He figured that soon enough he would be dead, and that would be better than being in Black Marsh. He wasn't too panicked about it at all when he felt his lungs fill with water and cold blackness fell upon him. For a while, for the first time in some time, Decimus Scotti felt peace, blessed darkness. And then pain came to him, and he felt himself coughing, spewing water up from his belly and his lungs. A voice said, "Oh bother, he's alive, ain't he now?" Scotti wasn't sure if that were true. Even when he opened his eyes and looked at the face above him, it was an Argonian, but unlike any he had seen anywhere. The face was thin and long, like a thick lance. The scales were ruby red, brilliant in the sunlight. It blinked at him, his eyelids opening and closing in vertical slits. "I don't suppose we should eat you, should we now?" The creature smiled, and Scotti could tell from its teeth that it was no idle suggestion. "Thank you," said Scotti weakly. He craned his head slightly to find out who the "we" were, and discovered he was on the muddy bank of the still, sludgy river, surrounded by a group of Argonians with similarly needle-like faces and a whole rainbow of scales, bright greens and gem-like purples, blues and oranges. "Can you tell me where? Am I near, well, anywhere?" The ruby-colored Argonian laughed. "No, you're in the middle of everywhere, and near nowhere." "Oh," said Scotti. He grasped the idea that space did not mean much in Black Marsh. "And what are you?" "We are Agacephs," the ruby-colored Argonian replied. "My name is Nomu." Scotti introduced himself. "I am a senior clerk in Lord Vennick's building commission in the Imperial City. My job was to come here and try to fix the problems with commerce, but I've lost my agenda, haven't met with any of my contacts, the Arcanes of Gideon." "Pompous, assimilated slaver kleptocrats," a small lemon-colored Agaseph murmured with some feeling. "And now I just want to go home." Nomu smiled, his long mouth arching up like a host happy to see an unwanted guest leave a party. "Shez will guide you." Shez, it seemed, was the bitter little yellow creature, and he was not at all pleased at the assignment. With surprising strength he hoisted Scotti up, and for a moment the clerk was reminded of Gomulus, dropping him into the bubbling muck that led the underground express. Instead, Shez shoved Scotti towards a tiny little raft, razor thin, that bobbed on the surface of the water. "This is how you travel?" "We don't have the broken wagons and dying horses of our brothers on the outside," Shez replied, rolling his tiny eyes. "We don't know better." The Argonian sat at the back of the craft and used his whip-like tail to propel and navigate the craft. They traveled quickly around the swirling pools of slime that stank of centuries of putrefaction, past pinnacled mountains that seemed sturdy but suddenly fell apart at the slightest ripple in the still water, under bridges that might have once been metal, but were now purely rust. "Everything in Tamriel flows down to Black Marsh," Shez said. As they slid through the water, Shez explained to Scotty that the Agasefs were one of the many Argonian tribes that lived in the interior of the province, near the Hist, finding little in the outside world worth seeing. He was fortunate to have been found by them. The Nagas, the toad-like of the Patru, the winged Sarpa, would have killed him on the spot. There were other creatures too to be avoided, though there were few natural predators in the inner Black Marsh. The scavengers that rooted the garbage seldom shelled away from a living meal. Hackwings circled overhead, like the ones Scotty had seen in the west. Shez fell silent and stopped the raft completely, waiting for something. Scotty looked in the direction Shez was watching, and saw nothing unusual in the filthy water. Then, he realized that the pool of green slime in front of them was actually moving, and fairly quickly, from one bank to the other. It deposited small bones behind it as it oozed up into the reeds, and disappeared. Voroplasm, Shez explained, moving the boat forward again. Big word. It'll strip you to the bone by the second syllable. Scotty, desirous with distract from himself from the sights and smells that surrounded him, thought it was a good time to compliment his pilot on his excellent vocabulary. It was particularly impressive, given how far from civilization they were. The Argonians in the east did, in fact, speak so well. They tried to erect a temple of Mara near here, in Umfolo, 20 years ago, Shez explained, and Scotty nodded, remembering reading about it in the files before they were lost. They all perished quite dreadfully of swamp rot in the first month, but they left behind some excellent books. Scotty was going to inquire further when he saw something so huge, so horrifying it made him stop, frozen. Half submerged in the water ahead was a mountain of spines, lying on 9-foot-long claws. White eyes stared blindly forward, and then suddenly the whole creature spasmed and lurched, the jaw of its mouth jutting out, exposing tusks clotted with gore. Swamp Leviathan, Shez whispered. Impressed. Very, very dangerous. Scotty gasped, wondering why the Agasef was so calm, and more, why he was continuing to steer the raft forward towards the beast. Of all the creatures in the world, the rats are sometimes the worst, said Shez, and Scotty noticed that the huge creature was only a husk. Its movement was from hundreds of rats that had burrowed into it, rapidly eating their way from the inside out, bursting from the skin in spots. They are indeed, Scotty said, and his mind went to the Black Marsh files, buried deep in the mud, and 4 decades of imperial work in Black Marsh. The two continued westward, through the heart of Black Marsh. Shez showed Scotty the vast complicated ruins of Kothringi capitals, fields of ferns and flowered grasses, quiet streams under canopies of blue moss, and the most astonishing sight of Scotty's life, the great forest of full-grown hist trees. They never saw a living soul until they arrived at the edge of the Imperial Commerce Road, just east of Slow Point, where Malik, Scotty's Red Guard guide, was waiting patiently. I was going to give you 2 more minutes, the Red Guard scowled, dropping the last of his food into a pile at his feet. No more, sir. The sun was shining bright when Decimus Scotty rode into the Imperial City, and as it caught the morning dew, it lent a glisten to every building as if they had been newly polished for his arrival. It astonished him how clean the city was, and how few beggars there were. The protracted edifice of Lord Vennick's building commission was the same as it always had been, but still the very sight of it seemed exotic and strange. It was not covered in mud. The people within actually generally worked. Lord Vennick himself, though singularly squat and squinty, seemed immaculate, not only relatively clean of dirt and scabs, but also relatively uncorrupt. Scotty couldn't help but stare at him when he first caught sight of his boss. Vennick stared back, You are a sight, the little fellow frowned. Did your horse drag you to Black Marsh and back? I would say go home and fix yourself, but there are a dozen people here to see you. I hope you have solutions for them. It was no exaggeration. Nearly 20 of Cyrodiil's most powerful and wealthiest people were waiting for him. Scotty was given an office even larger than Lord Vannick's, and he met with each. First among the Commission's clients were 5 independent traders, blustering and loaded with gold, demanding to know what Scotty intended to do about improving the trade routes. Scotty summarized for them the conditions of the main roads, the state of the merchants' caravans, the sunken bridges, and all the other impediments between the frontier and the marketplace. They told him to have everything replaced and repaired, and gave him the gold necessary to do it. Within 3 months, the bridge at Slough Point had disappeared into the muck. The great caravan had collapsed into decrepitude, and the main road from Gideon had been utterly swallowed up by swamp water. The Argonians began once again to use the old ways, their personal rafts, and sometimes the underground express to transport the grain in small quantities. It took a third of the time, 2 weeks, to arrive in Cyrodiil, none of it rotten. The Archbishop of Mara was the next silent client Scotty met with, a kind-hearted man. Horrified by the tales of Argonian mothers selling their children into slavery, he pointedly asked Scotty if it were true. Sadly, yes, Scotty replied, and the Archbishop showered him with septims, telling the clerk that food must be brought to the province to ease their suffering, and the schools must be improved so they could learn to help themselves. Within 5 months, the last book had been stolen from the deserted monastery in Umfolo. As the Arcanes went bankrupt, their slaves returned to his parents' tiny farms. The backwater Argonians found they could grow enough to feed their families provided they had enough hard workers in their enclave, and the buyer's market for slaves sharply declined. Ambassador Siecht, concerned about the rising crime in northern Blackmarsh, brought with him the contributions of many other expatriate Argonians like himself. They wanted more imperial guards on the border at Slough Point, more magically lit lanterns posted along the main roads at regular intervals, more patrol stations, and more schools built to allow young Argonians to better themselves and not turn to crime. Within 6 months there were no more Nagas roaming the roads, as there were no more merchants traveling them to rob. The thugs returned to the fetid inner swamp, where they felt much happier, their constitutions enriched by the rot and pestilence that they loved. Siecht and his constituency were so pleased by the crime rate dropping, they brought even more gold to Decimus Scotty, telling him to keep up the good work. Blackmarsh simply was, is, and always shall be unable to sustain a large-scale cash crop plantation economy. The Argonians, and anyone else, the world of Tamriel, could live in Blackmarsh on subsistence farming, just raising what they needed. That was not sad, Scotty thought. That was hopeful. Scotty's solution to each of their dilemmas had been the same. 10% of the gold they gave him went to Lord Vannick's building commission. The rest Scotty kept for himself and did exactly nothing about the requests. Within a year, Tacomas Scotty had embezzled enough to retire very comfortably, and Blackmarsh was better off than it had been in 40 years. Today's reading: Battle of Senguard. In Second Era, 852, allied Nord and Breton forces crossed the borders into Cyrodiil and occupied the major passes and settlements in the Gerald Mountains, making their headquarters for the winter at Senguard. The Nord-Breton allies dared King Cuchulainn's new general Talos to assault them in their mountain fastness. When they learned that General Talos had mustered an army in the dead of winter and was marching to assault Senguard, they were elated. Sancretor was impregnable, its citadel on high cliffs overlooking the lower city, nestled in a high mountain basin with steep, unscalable cliffs in their rear. The Cyrodiilic army was small, poorly trained and outfitted, short on rations and underprepared for winter campaigning. As their ragged units assembled in the lowlands beneath the citadel, the Nord-Breton allies confidently assumed their enemy had delivered himself into their trap. The citadel was not only protected by an unscalable cliff in front and unscalable heights in their rear, but the entrance to the citadel was magically concealed under the appearance of a large mountain lake in the basin beneath the heights. Accordingly, the Nord-Breton allies left on a small force to defend the citadel, descending through tower passages, through lower passages to attack and overwhelm the cold, hungry Cyrodiilic forces before them. They expected defeat, overrun, and annihilate General Talos's army, leaving no one to oppose their springtime descent into the Cyrodiilic heartlands. Thus did General Talos lure the Nord-Breton allies to their doom. Leaving a weak force in the lowlands to draw out the defenders, General Talos approached the citadel of Sancretor from the rear, descending the supposedly unscalable heights behind the citadel and sneaking into the supposedly magically concealed entrance to the inner citadel. This remarkable feat is attributed to the agency of a single unnamed traitor, by tradition a Breton turncoat sorcerer, who revealed both the existence of an obscure mountain trail down the heights behind the citadel and the secret of the citadel entrance concealed beneath its illusory lake surface. While the Cyrodiilic army, in the lowlands, fought a desperate defense against the Nord-Breton sortier, General Talos and his men entered the citadel, swept aside the sparse defense, captured the Nord-Breton nobles and generals, and compelled them to surrender the citadel and their armies. The confused and demoralized Nord captives, already suspicious of the scheming High Rock sorcerer aristocracy and their overreaching dreams of Heartland's conquests, deserted the alliance and swore loyalty to Tiber Septim. The Skyrim generals joined their rank and file in Tiber Septim's army. The High Rock Battle Mage command was summarily executed, and the captive Bretons imprisoned or sold into slavery. Thus was the concerted allied invasion of Cyrodiil foiled, and General Talos's army swelled by the hardened Nord veteran troops that played so crucial a role in General Talos's succeeding campaigns, which consolidated the Colovian and Nibenian into the core of the Cyrodiilic Empire, and which resulting in the crowning of General Talos as Emperor Tiber Septim. Historians marvel at Tiber Septim's tactical daring in assaulting a fortified mountain citadel in the dead of winter against vastly superior numbers. Later, Tiber Septim attributed his unwavering resolve against overwhelming obstacles to have been inspired by his divine vision of the Amulet of Kings in the tomb of Ramon III. The young Talos may indeed have been inspired by his belief that he was fated to recover this ancient sacred symbol of the Covenant, and to lead Tamriel to the high civilization of the Third Empire. Nonetheless, this should in no way reduce our admiration for the dash and genius of this defining military triumph against impossible odds. Today's reading: Before the Ages of Man. Before man came to rule Tamriel, and before the chronicles of the historians recorded the affairs of the rulers of Tamriel, the events of our world are known only through myths and legends, and through the divinely inspired teachings of the 9 divines. For convenience, historians divide the distant ages of prehistory into 2 broad periods of time, the Dawn Era and the Merethic Era. The Dawn Era. The Dawn Era is the period before the beginning of mortal time, when the feats of the gods take place. The Dawn Era ends with the exodus of the gods and magic from the world at the founding of the Adamantine Tower. The term Merethic comes from the Nordic, literally era of the elves. The Merethic era is the prehistoric time after the exodus of gods and magic from the world at the founding of the Adamantine Tower and before the arrival of Ysgramor, the Nord, in Tamriel. The following are the most notable events of the Dawn Era, presented roughly in sequence as it must be understood by creatures of time such as ourselves. The cosmos formed from the Orbis, chaos or totality, by Anu and Padme. Akatosh, Auriel, formed and time began. The gods formed. Lorcan convinced or tricked the gods into creating the mortal plane, Nirn. The mortal plane was at this point highly magical and dangerous. As the gods walked, the physical makeup of the mortal plane and even timeless continuity of existence itself became unstable. When Magic, architect of the plans for the mortal world, decided to terminate the project, the gods convened at the Adamantine Tower, the oldest known structure in Tamriel, and decided what to do. Most left when Magic did. Others sacrificed themselves into other forms so that they might stay. The Elnove. Lorcan was condemned by the gods to exile in the mortal realms, and his heart was torn out and cast from the tower, where it landed a volcano formed. With magic, in the mythic sense, gone, the cosmos stabilized. Elven history, finally linear, began. ME 2500. The Merethic Era. The Merethic Era was figured by early Nord scholars as a series of years numbered in reverse order backward from their beginning of time. The founding of the Cameron dynasty, recorded as year 0 of the First Era. The prehistoric events of the Merethic Era are listed here with their traditional Nordic Merethic dates. The earliest Merethic date cited by King Harold's scholars was ME 2500, the Nordic reckoning of the first year of time. As such, the Merethic era extends from ME 2500 in the distant past to ME 1, the year before the founding of the Cameron dynasty and the establishment of the White Gold Tower as an independent city-state. According to King Harold's bards, ME 2500 was the date of construction of the Adamantine Tower on Valfiera Island in High Rock, the oldest known structure of Tamriel. This corresponds roughly to the earliest historical dates given in various unpublished Elvish chronicles. During the early Merethic era, the aboriginal beast peoples of Tamriel, the ancestors of the Khajiit, Argonian, Orcish, and other beast folk, lived in pre-literate communities throughout Tamriel. In the Middle Merethic era, the Aldmeri, mortals of elven origin, refugees left their doomed and now lost continent of Aldamaris, also known as Old Elfane, and settled in the southwestern Tamriel. The first colonies were distributed at wide intervals on islands along the entire coast of Tamriel. Later inland settlements were founded primarily in fertile lowlands in southwest and central Tamriel. Wherever the beastfolk encountered the elves, the sophisticated, literate, technologically advanced Aldmeri cultures displaced the primitive beastfolk into the jungles, marshes, mountains, and wastelands. The Adamantine Tower was rediscovered and captured by the Durini, a prominent and powerful Aldmeri clan. The Crystal Tower was built on Somerset Isle and later White Gold Tower in Cyrodiil. During the Middle Merethic era, Aldmeri explorers mapped the coasts of Vardenfell, building the first era High Elven wizard towers at Ala Radinia, Balfell, Tel Arun, and Tel Mora in Morrowind. It was also during this period that Isled, Wild Elven, settlements flourished in the jungles surrounding White Gold Tower, present-day Cyrodiil. Wild Elves, also known as the Heartland High Elves, preserved the Dawn-era magics and language of the Elnofe, ostensibly a tribute land to the High King of Alinor. The Heartland's long lines of communication from the Somerset Isles' sovereignty effectively isolated Cyrodiil from the High Kings at Crystal Tower. The late Middle Merethic era is the period of the High Velothi culture. The Chimer, ancestors of the modern Dunmer, or Dark Elves, were dynamic, ambitious, long-lived elven clans devoted to fundamentalist ancestor worship. The Chimer clans followed the prophet Veloth out of the ancestral elven homelands in the southwest to settle in the lands now known as Morrowind. Despite the secular culture and profane practices of the Dwemer, the Chimer also coveted the lands of resources of the Dwemer, and for centuries provoked them with minor raids and territorial disputes. The Dwemer, dwarves, free-thinking, reclusive elven clans devoted to the secrets of science, engineering, and alchemy, established underground cities and communities in the mountain range, later the Velothi Mountains, separating modern Skyrim and Morrowind. The late Merethic era marks the precipitous decline of Velothi culture. Some Velothi settled in villages near declining and abandoned ancient Velothi towers. During this period, Velothi high culture disappeared on Vardenfell Island. The earliest Dwemer freehold colonies date from this period. Degenerate Velothi devolved into tribal cultures which, in time, evolved into the modern great houses of Morrowind, or persisted as the barbarian Ashlander tribes. The only surviving traces of the tribunal culture are scattered Velothi towers and Ashlander nomads on Vardenfell Island. The original First-era High Elven wizard towers along the coasts of Tamriel were also abandoned about this time. It was in the late Merethic era that the pre-literate humans, the so-called Nedic people, from the continent of Atmora, also Altmora, or the Elderwood, in Aldmeris, migrated and settled in the northern Tamriel. The Nord culture hero Ysgramor, leader of a great colonizing fleet to Tamriel, is credited with developing a runic transcription of Nord speech based on Elvish principles, and so Ysgramor is considered the first human historian. Ysgramor's fleet landed at Sarek Head at the extreme northern tip of Skyrim's Broken Cape. The Nords built there the legendary city of Sarthal. The elves drove the men away during the Night of Tears, but Ysgramor soon returned with his 500 companions. Also during the late Merethic era, the legendary immortal hero, warrior, sorcerer, and king, variously known as Pelennial, Whitestrake, Harold Harry Breeks, Ysmir, Hans the Fox, etc., wandered Tamriel, gathering armies, conquering lands, ruling, then abandoning his kingdoms to wander again.